Bedtime Reading. The War of the Worlds. Chapter 1. Before the War. It would have seemed impossible to anyone living at the end of the 19th century to think that the Earth were being scientifically observed by highly intelligent creatures on another planet. At that time, men went about their days as usual, thinking themselves completely safe and in control. The chances of other life existing on nearby planets were thought extremely small, and it was popularly believed that if such life did exist, it would probably be less intelligent than man. Yet soon man would awaken from this false dream, for the beings that lived on Mars, otherwise known as Martians, wanted the Earth for themselves, and were making preparations to take it. The planet Mars is much older than the Earth. Although we know little about the planet, we do know that most of its natural resources are nearly gone. Its oceans are disappearing, its air is without oxygen, and its temperatures are extremely low. Those living on Mars have been forced to do what people on Earth would do if they were in the same situation: look for a new home. How attractive the Earth must then look to them, with all of its oceans and greenery, and how stupid and simple we humans must seem. When you consider the importance of survival to all living beings, from man to the lowest form of life, it can be understood that the Martians had no choice but to attack our planet and take it from us. Yet today, when people look back on the Martian attack 6 years ago, many still think of the Martians as evil. But have humans not done the same kinds of things to animals and even to other human beings? If one were to consider how the natives of New Zealand were almost all killed by the Europeans, it does not seem so beyond human understanding. For years, the Martians made their preparations right under the noses of our scientists, who, although constantly observing, could not see Mars clearly enough through their instruments. In 1894, an observatory reported seeing a flash of light on the red planet. Looking back at that, I can only guess that that was the time they put their huge gun in place. Then, just 6 years ago, a scientist in Java reported that a large burst of fiery gas had been released from Mars and was coming toward Earth. Very few people, however, paid much attention to the discovery. One of the people who did was my friend Ogilvy. He was so excited by the news that he invited me to join him in his observatory the next evening. I remember looking through his telescope and thinking about how much space was out there between the stars and planets. Why, just between the Earth and Mars lay tens of millions of miles. The red planet looked so small, like the head of a pin. Then I caught sight of something, a flash of light. I told Ogilvy, and he took my place at the telescope. It was another burst of fire from Mars. He explained that it was probably large pieces of rock from space hitting the surface of the planet. I, of course, had no idea what it was, and just remember wishing I had a cigarette to smoke. The night was so quiet and peaceful. No one had any idea of the terrible danger that was coming straight for them in the night's silence. Over the next 10 days, a burst occurred each day at midnight. Soon the newspapers started to take more interest in the volcanoes of Mars. No one was willing to believe the idea that it might be someone or something trying to communicate with us from another planet. Ogilvy was even completely against the idea. It is almost humorous and wonderful to remember how man carried out his daily life just before the Martians arrived. I, for example, was learning how to ride a bicycle and was writing some philosophical papers on right and wrong in the modern world. I remember taking a walk with my wife and teaching her about the different patterns of stars in the sky. I even showed her which planet was Mars. There was a group of young people playing guitars and singing. The sound of the nearby train could be heard slowly moving along its tracks. The world felt very calm and peaceful. Chapter 2. A Star Falls. Then, one morning came reports of a falling star. Those who had seen it said that it had a green tail that remained in the sky a few minutes after the falling object had disappeared. At the moment it fell, I had been working in my study. My window was open, but I was too lost in thought to have noticed anything around me, let alone something falling from the sky. Hundreds of people saw it, but amazingly, no one thought to try and find where it had landed. No one except for my friend Ogilvy. He guessed that it should have struck the earth near the walking sand pits, and his guess was right. He arrived there to find a huge hole in the ground. Trees and huge piles of dirt had been thrown in all directions for hundreds of yards. Those trees that still stood were burning brightly in the night. Inside, almost entirely covered in sand, was the fallen object. It seemed to be shaped like a cylinder, about 30 meters wide. Ogilvy could see a strange, rough black material covering the entire disk, like a shell. It was still very hot from its entrance into the Earth's atmosphere. Then, suddenly, the black material began to fall away from the object in small pieces until one huge piece finally came off. When Ogilvy approached the pit to have a better look, he was surprised to see that the top of the thing was moving round and round in a circle. The top then began to slowly rise. It was at this point that Ogilvy realized that there was someone or something inside, and it was trying to get out. Without thinking, he ran down into the pit to try and help whomever it was inside to escape. But luckily, the heat of the machine prevented him from getting too close to touch the metal and burn himself. Ogilvy then ran for help. He met a farmer on the road and tried to explain what he had seen, but the farmer thought he was crazy and drove quickly away. Nor did the man opening the town store believe him when he was told the story. He thought that Ogilvy was dangerously mad, in fact, and tried to lock him inside the store. Ogilvy, however, escaped and realized that he had to calm down a little before approaching anyone else. He then visited a local journalist named Henderson. "Did you see that falling star this morning?" he asked the man. "Yes. What about it?" responded the journalist. "It's just over the hill there, at Horsehill Bridge. It's not a common space rock either. There's something inside of it." Henderson dropped his gardening tools and ran off to the sandpits with Ogilvy. When they arrived, the thing was just as Ogilvy had left it, but now there was a thin, bright piece of metal that wrapped around the center of the cylinder, and air seemed to be coming from or going into it. They knocked on the metal surface with a stick, but no response came. The two men decided to inform all of the newspapers about it. By 8 o'clock, all kinds of men had gathered around the sandpit to have a look at the dead Martians. That's how the newspaper stories were describing the strange thing in the pit. I heard my newspaper boy shouting the news in the street soon after, while I was writing in my study. I could hardly believe my ears and wasted no time getting to the pits as quickly as I could. Chapter 3. A Gathering Crowd. When I got to the pit, there were about 20 or so people standing around it. My friend Ogilvy and Henderson were not there. I guessed that they had probably decided to get some food in their bellies before coming back to spend the day observing the strange object. The people currently looking at it were a mixture of townspeople, farmers, gardeners, a woman with her child, and some impatient boys who, until I told them to stop, were expressing their boredom and disappointment by throwing rocks at the cylinder. In reality, from a distance, the object was not at all impressive. It looked like a common man-made object. However, when I walked down into the pit and took a closer look, I saw that the metal covering it was nothing like the metal we are used to on Earth. It had a slightly different color. I knew almost right away that it had come from Mars, but I doubted that it contained any living things inside. My best guess was that it would simply contain items from another planet's civilization, things such as currency, writing, or maybe even pictures. I hoped that they would soon open it so that we could have a look inside. Standing there and looking at the thing only made me more impatient. I decided to return home for a little while. By the afternoon, the sand pits were entirely crowded with people from all over. Neither the heat of the day nor the lack of sheltering trees could keep people from coming miles to see the mysterious cylinder from Mars. One ambitious salesman even set up a stand to sell apples and drinks to the gathering crowd. As I approached the pit, I found Ogilvy, along with 5 other scientists, working around the cylinder. One of the men, Stent, was from the Royal Astronomical Society. He was standing on top of the metal object, giving orders to people here and there to dig. Much more of the machine could now be seen. However, the bottom was still deeply set in the sand. Ogilvy then called to me to join him in the pit, where he asked if I would be willing to find the owner of the sand pits, Lord Hilton. It seemed that the crowd of people was preventing the scientists from doing their work, and they wanted a fence to be built around the hole in order to keep the people out. He also said that they could hear some sounds coming from inside the object, and the softness of the sound might indicate that the walls of the cylinder were extremely thick. I left at once, only to find that the landowner was away on business and would be returning later that evening at about 6. I then went home for tea and made plans to meet the gentleman as soon as he arrived at the train station. Chapter 4. The Opening of the Cylinder. By sunset, the crowd around the pit had grown to 200 or 300. Upon my return, I noticed that those gathered around were shouting and pushing each other so that they could see inside the pit better. I wondered what could be happening. Then a boy started running away from the crowd. As he passed me, he shouted, "It's opening! The thing's opening! I think it's dangerous! I'm leaving!" As soon as I joined the excited crowd, I heard people shouting that a man had fallen into the pit. I fought my way toward the front, and once there, saw a man trying to climb back out of the hole. He looked terribly frightened. Behind him, the top of the cylinder was indeed starting to turn and rise up like a screw. "Stay away from it!" I heard Ogilvy shout to the people. A moment later, the top of the machine had risen as far as it could and then fell over into the pit. It made a loud crashing sound as it struck the metal below. Then there was silence, while everyone stared into the dark entrance of the machine. I think everyone believed that a thing that looked like a human would come out to greet them. However, What slowly rose up out of the darkness was not at all human, not even close. It looked more like a thin, gray snake. Then more snake-like things started to follow. The interest of the people around the pit quickly changed to great fear. Everyone began to run away. I, however, found that I could not stop watching. The best that I could do was to back up slowly. The poor fellow who had fallen in earlier was still trying to climb his way out of the pit. Then, a large thing, about the size of a bear, slowly rose from the cylinder's entrance. It was a grayish color, and from the way it shined in the sunlight, its skin appeared to be wet. Its head was very large and round. Its face was made up of 2 huge eyes and a small V-shaped mouth which dripped with water. From the sound of its labored breathing, it seemed to be struggling to rise against the earth's gravity. Its appearance was horrible to see. I was frightened by it. Suddenly, the Martian fell over into the pit. It made a loud thud as it hit the metal below. And immediately another head rose up from out of the entrance. My curiosity long having been satisfied, I now felt nothing but fear. So I ran as quickly as I could to the nearest trees. When I looked back toward the pit, I saw the head of the man who had fallen in. He had managed to get one leg over the edge of the pit, but then he fell back a little. Finally, he disappeared entirely, and I thought that I could hear a scream from below. I wanted to run and help him, but my fear was too great. And the same was true for the hundreds of people hiding behind trees, bushes, behind anything that they could find like myself. If anyone had come along at that time, they would have found a strange sight indeed. All of these people hiding and silently waiting, their horses left alone to eat their oats in the middle of the sandpits. We talked for several hours about his plans. Although I could see some problems with his ideas, I liked them nonetheless, and started to feel his excitement. We then went back to his hiding place in the basement of a house on Putney Hill. He showed me the hole that he had been digging for the past week or so. I must admit that I was a bit disappointed. I felt that I could have done as much work in one day. Regardless, I helped him to dig further, for he believed that underneath were the tunnels he had earlier spoken about. I helped him dig for about an hour, thinking more and more about the problems with his plans. Then he stopped and suggested that we go out and have a look around for Martians. I did not understand why this was necessary and suggested that we keep digging, but then I thought about how I had run into him out among the fields. "Why weren't you here digging earlier?" I asked. "Oh, I just thought I'd have a nice walk," he said. "But aren't you in a hurry to get through to the underground? Why stop working?" He only answered by suggesting that we go have another look about town for Martians. I then understood that this man was not quite as strong-willed as he had led me to believe. We went outside and walked about the village. We saw nothing but patches of that red Martian plant life here and there, covering sections of the fields and climbing up the sides of trees, mingling with the leaves. While walking about, he told me a story about some survivors who had not left London like the rest of the people. This small group of people had somehow managed to get the electricity back on in a certain part of the city. Seeing their success, they all went out into the street and partied well into the evening, drinking and singing and dancing. Suddenly, one of the Martian fighting machines appeared and picked up about 200 of those people and disappeared down the street. We then returned to the house, and my companion became more cheerful. He was happy to have me around, it seemed. Together we made a rather big meal, and afterwards smoked cigars of the highest quality. Then we spent much of the rest of the day drinking champagne and playing card games. Eventually the artilleryman fell asleep from all of his drinking. I had only 2 glasses, for I did not like champagne very much, nor was I especially in the mood for celebration. I decided to go outside again and have a look at those lights he had mentioned to me earlier in the day. As I looked off into the distant red glow of the still burning area of Kensington, I began to feel ashamed of myself. Here I was eating large meals, smoking cigars, and drinking champagne, while the rest of humanity was suffering just a few miles away. I immediately decided to leave this man to his useless dreams and go on to London to see what the people who really wanted to save the human race were doing. Chapter 24. Walking Through the Remains of London. As I moved further and further into London, I found the streets covered in black dust. The only people I saw were those lying dead in the street, their bodies horribly burned. I did come across one living man, but he was so drunk that he could not stand. His clothing was completely covered in dust, and when I tried to talk with him, he did nothing but shout at me and try to hit me with his bottle. I walked on, thinking how strange the silence was. It was not a peaceful silence, but a dangerous one in which one expects something horrible to happen. When I reached South Kensington, the silence was suddenly broken by the sound of a fighting machine that was coming. I stayed in the shadows along Exhibition Street and made my way toward Hyde Park. Along the way, I came upon a bus that had been pushed over onto its side. Nearby, there were the remains of a horse that had been completely eaten down to the bone by some kind of animal. Again, the cry of the fighting machine filled the air. "Oola, oola, oola!" I could not see it, but it seemed to be coming closer, or I was coming closer to it. I turned off again, now headed for Oxford Street. As I walked, the faces of old friends came into my mind, and once again I realized how lonely I was. I missed my old way of life terribly. Eventually, I broke into a restaurant where I found some food and drink. Afterward, I felt sleepy, and so I went to a back room and lay down on the sofa to have a rest. When I later awoke, the sun was setting, and I could still hear the crying of the Martian machine. Not feeling particularly safe in the pub, I walked back out into the streets and continued my tour of the now dead city of London. After only a few minutes, I found myself near Baker Street. Just over the tops of some trees, there appeared the head of the Martian machine that had been crying out all this time. Strangely enough, I did not feel afraid. I walked out into the open, staring curiously at the giant machine, and it did nothing but remain motionless. I decided that I should get a better look at the machine, so I turned down some back streets and made my way toward it from the east. When it came into sight again, I could see that it had been seriously damaged. It looked as though it had run into a building and fallen underneath the ruins. With the last of the day's sunlight, I could just barely see what I thought might be blood in the driver's seat. I moved on and found another Martian fighting machine at Primrose Hill. It too cried out, "Oola, oola, oola," and did not move. As I passed by, I noticed on the other side of the Martian that the red plant life had spread through London's river canals. Then the crying of the machine suddenly stopped, and a shocking silence fell over the city. The stillness made me frightened again. I felt that I was surrounded by enemies waiting in the darkness for the right moment to attack. Everything looked evil. Even the houses with their ghost-like windows seemed to be watching me. I began to run toward Kilburn and spotted a horrible-looking body lying far down the road before me. I turned and went in another direction for fear of what I might find. For the rest of the night, I closed myself inside a cabman's shelter and waited for my courage to return. Then, just before sunrise, I decided to go back out into the streets to have a look. I found my way back to Primrose Hill, and the first thing that I saw was yet another Martian fighting machine. Just like the others, it now stood silent, as though sleeping. Upon walking closer, I saw dozens of birds flying in circles about its domed head. My heart suddenly leaped with excitement, and I began to run toward the giant. An idea had formed in my mind, but I did not want to use it before I actually knew the truth. I finally made it to the top of the hill that overlooked the last pit the Martians had made. It was huge and filled with all kinds of war machines and bodies. This time, however, the bodies were not human. No, there before me lay the bodies of at least 50 Martians. I wanted to shout with joy at the sight. The Martians, despite their incredible intelligence and their highly advanced technology, had lost the battle in the end. The battle had not, however, been won by the humans, whose weapons proved useless in the fight. It had been won by the earth, by nature. The Martians, who were not exposed to any bacteria on Mars, were practically swimming in it here on our planet. Although bacteria often bring sickness and death to men, this time it had saved us all from the Martians. Looking down into the pit, I could now see the flying machine that the Martians had been building just before they fell to their deaths. Dozens of dogs were running about the pit, eating the Martian bodies. It was strange indeed to look at the once horrifying fighting machines and now feel no fear whatsoever. I wanted to laugh at their harmlessness. From where I stood, I could see most of London spread out before me. How amazing it was that it still stood here after so much death and destruction. And even though terribly damaged, how lovely and alive it looked to me now. Soon, people would be returning to London and their homes. They would begin their lives again. I could already hear the sound of hammers at work in my mind, and what beautiful music it made. And then the thought of my own home and my family came back to me. Hope came upon me stronger than ever before. Maybe I could have my old life back again. Chapter 25. My Return Home. I am not sure why, but I cannot remember what happened over the next 3 days. I must have been completely overcome with relief and joy. Over time, I learned that I was not quite the first person to realize the end of the Martians had come. It turns out that while I was hiding in the cabman's shelter, another gentleman had come across the dead Martians and immediately set out to inform the world by telegraph. I had no idea that at the very same moment I was looking down upon the ruins of the Martian pit, most of the world was celebrating the liberation of England. Of course, the last people to know were the English themselves, for most of them were still in hiding. However, once the news reached them, they came running back to their beloved London. Countries from all over the world began to send food to the English, and it seemed that every ship in the ocean was headed toward our fair country. As for me, an extremely kind family found me wandering the streets, half mad, singing songs about being the last man alive in the world. They took me into their home and took care of me, patiently waiting and hoping I would soon regain my senses. I, of course, did calm down after about 4 days. They gave me another day's rest before breaking the news to me that all of Leatherhead had been destroyed. Not a single person survived the attack. I stayed with them for 4 more days, feeling hopelessly sad and lonely. They did their best to help me, which I find amazing, considering that they had their own problems to deal with. The desire to revisit my hometown was so strong in me that I told the family that I would have to leave right away. They tried to change my mind, but I could not be reasoned with. I set out on the 9th day and found the streets of London once again alive with thousands of people. I was very surprised to see that some stores had already reopened and that water was flowing from some of the fountains in the squares. The sun that day was so bright that I felt it was making a joke of my sad situation. Most of the people I saw on the street seemed to be either unbelievably happy or quietly accepting of their circumstances. Most of the people looked tired and unhealthy. Their clothing was still dirty and their hair a filthy mess. While crossing Waterloo Bridge, I caught sight of a man selling newspapers. It was the first newspaper to go back into print. The news indicated that much had already been learned from the scientists' examination of the Martian equipment. The scientists even thought that they had discovered the secret of flying. Much to my relief, I had an entire compartment on the train all to myself. It seemed that over the 9 days of my recovery, most of the people had managed to return to their homes. I had no desire to converse with anyone, and spent the entire train ride silently staring out the window at the changed countryside. Most of the towns I passed were in smoking ruins. Only one town seemed untouched, but that was only because its thick forest of pine trees hid the destruction from the train passengers. When I arrived at Byfleet Station, I exited the train and walked toward my town of Maybury. I came upon the overturned wagon I had rented from the pub owner, and next to it were the bones of his horse. I stood there in quiet thought for quite some time before moving on. A man standing outside of the neighborhood pub greeted me by name as I approached. I returned the greeting and asked about the pub owner. He told me that he had been buried a few days before. I thanked him for the information and started the last few meters to my home. At first, I thought that there was hope for my wife to be there, but that thought quickly disappeared when I saw that the house was in the same condition I had left it in that night of the storm. The lock on the front door was broken, and when I entered the front hallway, I saw stains on the floor from when I had returned to the house, soaking wet and hidden from the Martians. The tracks of both mine and the artilleryman's footsteps still led up the stairs and into my study, and there on the table lay the paper on which I had started my latest philosophical article. I went back downstairs and saw the remains of the meal the artilleryman and I had had before running out of town. The house was so silent and lonely. I felt a terrible sadness building up inside of me. Then I heard a voice from behind me say, "Let's go. It was unwise to come here. It's obvious that no one has survived." For a moment, I thought that I might have said the words to myself, but then I ran to the window and found myself looking into the eyes of my cousin and my wife. We stayed that way, silent and staring in disbelief for several moments before I saw my wife's eyes start to turn upward, and I ran to catch her before she completely fainted. Epilogue. As I look back on the pages I have here written, it has become clear to me that not everyone will completely agree with my story. There are many questions about why and how the Martians died so quickly. I, however, am not an expert in the area of biological science, so I am happy with the popular reports. It has not yet been made clear what exactly the Martians' black gas consisted of. Scientists found an unknown substance among the contents, but they have yet to understand it completely, nor are its effects on the human body very clear. Of course, because so few people actually saw the Martians themselves, people have taken great interest in the Martian body that has been preserved and put on display at the Museum of Natural History in London. Very few of these were remaining due to the number of wild dogs that had seized upon them just after death. This one is almost in perfect condition. Surprisingly, one subject which is not very often discussed is the possibility of another Martian attack. Personally, I am quite concerned, for it seems very likely to happen someday. I feel that we should be keeping a close eye on Mars, especially the area where the gun was seen shooting the cylinders to our planet. Earth should always be ready for a second attack. In fact, I think that the Martians' failure has given humans a hint as to how to defend themselves should history repeat itself. For example, we now know that the Martians are powerless when they first land, for they have to wait for their cylinder to cool or they will burn themselves. We could simply destroy the cylinder during this early period. If no bombs are available at the time, guns could be set upon the Martians as they first come out of their cylinder. In other words, I do not think that the Martians will have as easy a time if they attacked us in the same manner. But then again, they may be aware of this themselves and could already have started planning a new method of attack. In any case, the attack on Earth has benefited man in some ways. First of all, it has made us more aware of the idea that perhaps we are not the highest form of life in the universe. This is a good thing because man had become quite arrogant and abused his powers over less powerful creatures like animals and plants. Maybe now man will be kinder to the animals on this planet. The second benefit is the technology that has been passed on to us. I believe that over the next 100 years, man may make incredible scientific leaps forward. Who knows? Maybe one day we will be visiting other planets ourselves. I have to say that I am not as comfortable with my life on Earth as I was before the war. Every day I look out the window of my study, and I see the slowly recovering landscape once again on fire. I see the milkman pass my home and the children running to school, and I remember all of those frightened faces as people ran from Woking that terrible Saturday. I visit London and I see all of the business in the streets, the fruit sellers and the pub owners, and I remember all of those horribly burned bodies that filled the streets. I pass the still motionless metal fighting machine that today stands in the center of town as a reminder of the war, and a terrible cold feeling runs through my body as I recall that stormy night when that first giant fighting machine walked over me as I lay helpless in the mud. I am always thinking about these events, but the thing that affects me the most and always brings me to tears is when I look at my wife and think that she and I once thought the other was dead. I hope that the people of the future will never experience such terrible things. However, I am afraid that future people of the earth will experience more war and death. Not because of more Martian attacks, but because men will continue to fight with each other. It is my hope that of all the things that we learned from the Martians, is we learned the need for peace on earth, for that is the best way for the human race to survive. Chapter 5. The Killing Begins. I could not move. So amazed was I at all that I had just seen. Yet I wanted so badly to see more, especially inside that entrance to their machine. I started to slowly walk in a wide circle around the pit that hid the Martians from view, never once taking my eyes off of it. Several long snake-like arms came wiggling out of the hole for a very brief moment, and then disappeared again back down below. Then a long, thin metal rod rose up out of the pit. At the top of it spun a round object similar to a mirror. I wondered what they could be doing. Most of the people had gathered into two groups, one on the right of the pit and the other on the left. I was standing pretty much alone. I approached one man and recognized him to be a neighbor of mine. His eyes clearly showed he was terrified. "What horrible-looking monsters!" he cried over and over again. "Did you see a man down in the pit?" I asked. He, however, did not respond to my question at all, but continued to stare at the mysterious hole in the ground. I decided to try and get a better view from a small hill nearby. As I stood there, I saw that all around the pit, small groups of men had begun to gradually walk closer and closer. They would move a few feet and then stop to wait and see if anything would happen. One of the little groups was holding and waving, high up in the air, a white flag on a stick. They apparently wanted to show the Martians that we were men of some intelligence with whom they could communicate. At the time, I could not make out who was part of that group, but I later learned that my friend Ogilvy and Stent were included among them. By this time, the pit was almost completely surrounded by people who, little by little, were approaching the cylinder. A bright flame suddenly flew straight up into the air from the pit. The light reflected green from the surrounding people's faces and then quickly disappeared. Then, a large domed object slowly rose out from the pit. Seconds later, a clear, almost invisible beam of energy shot from the object, and the men gathered around the flag, one by one, burst into flames. The rest of the people, who had been following close behind, turned and ran. I, again, could not move for a moment. I was so amazed by the sight before me. I had not yet realized that these flames running about in front of me were dying men. That single shot of invisible heat from the Martian ship had quickly moved from man to man and was now spreading to the surrounding trees and faraway buildings. I followed the path of destruction to try and see in which direction the danger was headed. I saw a horse suddenly catch on fire, without even having time to cry out. Then a row of bushes burst into flame, and it was at that moment I could see that the heat ray was moving toward me and coming much too fast for me to be able to move out of its path. Suddenly, everything became quiet, and the thing in the pit slowly moved back down and out of sight. I had been lucky. If it had continued just a few seconds longer, I would not be here today to tell the story. All around me, the ground was burned black. The group of men who had been holding the white flag had now completely disappeared into nothing. They were all dead. Houses could be seen burning in the distance toward the town of Woking. The smell of burnt flesh and wood filled the air. Nothing could be seen of the Martians except for their metal rod with the spinning mirror on top. The silence, together with the smell, suddenly made me aware of the terrible fear growing deep inside of me. I immediately began to run away through the fields. I ran like I had never run before, full of terror and crying like a frightened little child. I felt that I had no control over the situation. Nowhere was safe any longer. It seemed that at any moment I could be struck from behind by that soundless, invisible heat ray. Chapter 6. Chobham Road. It is still unclear how the Martians are able to kill such large numbers so quickly. Our best guess, so far, is that they have a way of creating, storing, and releasing an enormous amount of heat. They then use a rounded mirror, made from some special material, to reflect this heat onto whatever target they wish to destroy. With this kind of weapon, they can melt the strongest metal like it was butter. The tall grass in the fields around the sand pits burned brightly all night long. The only people in the area were those 40 who had fallen victim to the heat ray and now lay there burned and unrecognizable. The nearby towns all received word of the Martian machine at about the same time. Stores immediately closed, and workers, having finished a full day's work, gathered with their girlfriends or wives in the street that led to the sand pits, eager to have a look at the strange circular object. None of them had heard that the cylinder had opened. When they arrived, they found about 200 people gathered and talking excitedly. They quickly joined them and caught up on the news. Then, of course, the heat ray came up out of the pit and started the killing. By that time, probably 300 people had gathered in the fields there. A policeman on horseback was also there to try and keep some order, for, as with all crowds, there were some who might start behaving badly and do harm to the Martian cylinder. Ogilvy and Stent, just before returning to the pit with their white flag, had made a request for a team of soldiers to be sent to guard the pit. When the destruction began, the people ran away in all directions. They were all, in fact, lucky to have survived, for the heat ray had moved in a full circle around the pits. If there had not been a long bar of sand running through the field to prevent the spread of the fire, all 300 of the onlookers would surely have been killed. At one point, the heat ray shot just above the crowd's heads, setting fire to the surrounding buildings. Both trees and buildings fell before the running crowd, causing them all to stop for a moment. Clothing caught on fire, and hundreds of screams went out into the night. The horseman ran directly through the crowd, not caring who he might injure in his escape. A woman yelled,
"Oh my God! They're coming after us!"
And this set the whole crowd running again. People began to push their way through the crowd, knocking people off of their feet and running them over. Several women and a small child were killed in this way. The rest, however, managed to survive. Chapter 7. How I Made It Home. I remember very little of my actual escape from the field. All that I recall is a feeling that I was too slow and clumsy. I thought that I would certainly die that night. Having run as far and as quickly as my body would allow, I reached a place where two roads met. I could go no farther. My legs were too weak and frightened. I fell to the ground and must have lay there for quite a while. When finally I got back on my feet, I found that my fear had completely left me. I was no longer the scared little child I had been just a short while ago. I felt so different that I began to wonder if I had not imagined the whole thing. One thing was for sure, however, my body was very tired and weak. I walked toward a nearby bridge and came upon an old man. He greeted me politely and walked on. I, in my confusion, did not respond. The night was silent. I saw people standing in the doorway to some restaurants across the way, talking casually, the sound of soft music and forks and knives striking plates in the background. The sound of a train then cut through the quiet of the evening, its carriages lit by soft yellowish light, and then it was gone. I felt strange, as though I were not a part of this world. It seemed that I was just observing everything from some other place far away. It is quite difficult to explain this feeling. Here, everything seemed so normal, and yet just down the road was death and destruction. I walked up to the people in front of the restaurant. "Have you heard any news from the sand pits?" I asked. "Ah, not you too. People have been talking all kinds of nonsense about them, their fields," said one of the men. "But the Martians," I cried. "Enough of your Martians," they all said, and returned to their previous discussion. I then returned home. My wife was terribly frightened by my appearance. I went into the dining room and poured myself a drink. I needed to calm down before telling her what I had seen. She joined me at the table and waited impatiently. Finally, I told her. To finish my story, I tried comforting her and myself a little by saying, "Well, At least they're incredibly slow. I don't think that they'll be able to leave the pit, actually, so we're safe as long as we stay away from the fields." My wife's face turned ghostly white. She worried that they might somehow manage to come and destroy the whole town. I tried to make her feel better by explaining what Ogilvy had told me about the difficulties Martians would have living on Earth. I told her about the Martians' discomfort with the force of gravity here, which was 3 times stronger than the gravity on Mars. Therefore, the weight of their own bodies must cause them great pain and make it difficult for them to move. This was the popular belief among the newspapers the next day. What we failed to consider was that the abundance of oxygen on Earth more than made up for the heaviness of gravity. And, of course, the fact that the Martians had highly advanced equipment which could make their movement on Earth easier or possibly unnecessary. "They are probably frightened themselves," I said. "They probably did not expect to find intelligent life here. But if things get too bad, we'll have to drop a bomb on them. That'll kill them all." And so, this is how we comforted ourselves, my wife and I. Our dining room, our conversation, and that night are all still very clear in my mind, like a photograph. The red glow of our wine glasses, and my wife's beautifully innocent smile under the soft light of the lamp. I did not know it at the time, but that was the last proper meal I was to have for quite some time thereafter. Chapter 8. Friday evening. That Friday it seemed that no one was too concerned about what had happened. This was especially the case for anyone living more than 5 miles outside of Woking. The London newspaper had not even printed a story because Henderson, who had been killed, did not send them a second message to confirm everything he had first reported. In Woking itself, people talked, of course, about what had happened. Crowds would gather round those who had lived to tell the story about the heat ray. However, the fact that those same deadly Martians were just a mile or 2 away did not prevent the people of Woking from living their ordinary daily lives. Families dined in restaurants, children did their homework, and lovers kissed in the street, just the same as always. Travelers would pass through Woking and see only the faint glow of red light and smoke rising up in the distance, where the fields still burned. It looked like nothing to them. In reality, of course, it was more than just fields, but entire homes that were still afire. The people who lived near the sandpits kept away from the area and watched and waited at the bridges, which they thought was a safe distance. Those who dared to get a closer look at the Martians, and there were very few who did, never returned from their attempt. Occasionally, a green cloud of smoke would rise up from the fields, accompanied by the sound of hammering. The Martians worked all day and night without rest. They seemed to be making preparations, but for what, nobody knew. So this was the situation on Friday evening. Like a poisonous insect that has bitten into the Earth's body, the Martian vehicle remained there in the pit, readying itself for further destruction. Although the rest of the world was going about its day as if nothing were happening, soon it would fall under the sickness of war. It was simply a matter of time before the poison spread far enough. That night, the military arrived and formed several groups around the edge of the fields. One group had tried to set up a base within the fields, but they all disappeared. All in all, about 400 soldiers were deployed to contain the Martians' pit. As usual, there was a crowd of people gathered in Chertsey Road. While one of the military leaders asked them questions, a second falling star came whistling through the sky above and disappeared to the northwest. It, too, left a glowing green trail behind and sent up a flash of bright white light where it seemed to strike the earth. Chapter 9. The War Begins. Saturday morning I got up early from what had been a sleepless night. I went into my garden and listened to the world around me. It seemed no different from any other morning. I even heard the sound of a train passing through town in the distance. Then the milkman came by on his wagon. I met him outside my garden walls and asked him if he had heard any news about the Martians. He told me that he heard the army had surrounded the pits and that they had sent for guns, although they hoped they would not have to use them. As I walked back toward my kitchen door, I saw my neighbor out in his garden, pulling up strawberries. I went over to chat with him briefly. "I think it'll all be over by the end of the day," he said. "It's really too bad that the Martians are being so difficult. We could learn so much from each other." Handing me a batch of strawberries, he added, "They say a second Martian thing has landed over in that forest of pines." He pointed his finger to a cloud of smoke rising in the northwest. "They've got that place surrounded, too, with military." After breakfast, I could not work, so I decided to take a walk over near the fields. I came upon a team of soldiers who were blocking the road to the pits. They told me that no one was allowed to pass. I chatted with them a bit and told them about my experience the other night. None of them had seen a Martian, so they were full of questions. When I told them about the deadly heat ray, they became even more excited and started to discuss the best ways to fight the Martians. "We should surprise them by approaching quietly," said one of them. "Idiot! There's nothing to hide behind out in their fields," argued another. "We should dig holes around the pits and fight them from there." "What, are you some kind of rabbit or something?" said yet another soldier. "Now, you said they look like some kind of 8-armed sea monster." "Yes, an octopus," I answered. "Well, I say we just bomb those bastards," suggested the third man. "Nah, that'd take too long. Let's kill them quickly," countered the first. I left them arguing in this way and went to the train station to get a morning paper. The townspeople seemed once again to feel safe with the military there. The houses around the field were all emptied, and the people ordered to stay somewhere in the village. I was disappointed by what I read in the newspapers. It seemed that I knew much more than they. Their description of the way Ogilvy and Stent were killed was completely wrong. I got most of my news directly from the soldiers. They said that a few attempts had been made to communicate with the Martians. One man crawled behind a hill and held up a white flag, but the Martians paid no attention to it at all. Then, at about 3 o'clock, I could hear the sound of heavy guns being fired from far away. I was told that the military was bombing the forest where the second Martian vehicle had landed. They hoped to destroy it before it opened. At 5 o'clock, the surrounding army at Woking received a large gun as well. Later, while my wife and I were sitting down to tea, we heard an explosion come from the fields. It was then followed by an explosion just down the road from our home. I ran outside and found that the entire roof of the neighboring church had been blown completely off. And looking up at the roof of my own home, it seemed that a piece of that explosion had done some damage to the brick wall outside of my study. I looked over toward the area where the fields lay and saw that our home was within easy reach of that terrible heat ray. I ran inside and, taking hold of my wife, brought her out into the street. "We've got to get away from here," I shouted. Behind me, the military had begun to fire once again upon the sand pits.
"Where shall we go?"
my wife asked. "We'll go to your cousin's home in Leatherhead." All around town, people were running out of their houses into the streets. I told my wife to stay where she was and then ran to a nearby pub where I knew the owner kept a horse and wagon. When I got there, he did not seem to be aware of what was happening. He was in the middle of selling one of his pigs to a villager. I interrupted and asked him to loan me his horse and wagon for £2. He stood for a moment, surprised at my behavior, but then agreed to it. I promised him that I would return it that same day, and then went around back and drove the horse and wagon quickly on to my home, not thinking about the fact that the pub owner might also need it to get away. Once home, I set my wife up on the driver's seat, placed the servant in the wagon, and then ran inside to collect a few of our most valuable things. When I came back out, a soldier ran up to me and told me to hurry up and get out of town. "It came out of the vehicle, some kind of thing that looked like the cover of a dish," he yelled, and then ran off to the next house. I threw our valuables into the wagon, climbed into the driver's seat, and whipped the horses into a full run. As soon as we were a safe distance from the town of Woking, I looked back. Thick smoke was rising up from the village, along with occasional bursts of red flame. I could hear the sounds of machine gun fire, but then they would quickly die away. It appeared that the Martian's heat ray was destroying everything within its range. I then turned back around and focused on driving. People were coming towards us from the surrounding fields, running for their lives. I did my best to keep the horses under control and get as far away from danger as I possibly could. Chapter 10. The Return to Maybury. We arrived in Leatherhead at around 9 o'clock. The gunfire had stopped long ago. A strange silence lay over the evening darkness. My wife had not said a single word during our escape from Woking. I tried to comfort her by reminding her of the Martian's limited ability to move, but she only stared off into the night before us. We sat down to dinner with our cousins and told them about what we had seen. The time then came for me to keep my promise to the pub owner. My wife tried to get me to stay there with her, but I told her I had to return. Her face went white with fear for my life. As for my own feeling, I was foolishly excited by it. I liked the idea of returning to the battle, and even secretly hoped that the army had not yet successfully killed the Martians, so that I might get a chance to experience a little of the battle. The night seemed darker than usual. Luckily, I knew the road pretty well, or I might have wrecked the wagon. As I came closer to town, I saw that the sky above it glowed a dark and mysterious red. A storm was blowing in and mixing with the red clouds. The town itself seemed lifeless. I could not tell if the dark houses were empty or filled with peacefully sleeping people. I passed a small group of people who were looking off toward the direction of the fields. They said nothing to me. I drove on and soon could see my neighborhood up on Maybury Hill, outlined in a red glow. Then a bright green light flashed far to my right. I looked up into the sky and saw a green trail coming from the storm clouds. Returning my gaze from the heavens, I saw that green smoke was rising up from out of a nearby forest. I then realized that it was a third Martian ship. A crack of lightning then shot from the sky. The storm had begun. This frightened my horse and sent it running. I had never experienced such a violent thunderstorm. The lightning came very frequently, and the air seemed charged with strange electricity. As I dashed through the streets of Woking, I caught sight of something coming down the hill opposite my street. In the darkness, it looked like the roof of one of the houses had fallen off. But then a flash of lightning revealed that it was something quite different. This thing was taller than a house, and it had 3 long mechanical legs. From its huge round head hung those snake-like arms I had seen come from out of the pit before. It was moving quite rapidly. Then, directly in front of me, I saw another one making its way through the forest, turning over trees as though they were nothing more than tall grass. It was coming straight for me. At the sight of this, I lost control of myself. I pulled hard on the rein to get my horse to turn around. My horse stopped too suddenly, and I soon found myself flying through the air. Fortunately, I landed in a large puddle of mud. When I turned to try and find my horse, I saw that it lay dead with the wagon on top of it. I then stopped moving, for I could hear the sound of metal approaching, and moments later, that huge monster I had seen coming through the trees walked over me. And then it was gone. Half of a mile down the road, where it met up with its partner near the place where a third Martian ship had landed. For a while I sat in the mud puddle without moving, watching those metal things moving in the distance. At times, when the lightning calmed, I would lose sight of them altogether, but then another flash would light up the sky, and they would be clear again, making their way through the forest. At that time, I was in very bad condition. I was terribly weak, wet, and confused. For some reason, I wanted to get to my house up on Maybury Hill. Looking back on that moment, the better thing would have been to find my way back to my wife. But again, my mind was not very clear. I did my best to get up and run for my house. The streets were very muddy from the heavy rain. I fell several times and, at one point, hurt my knee on a rock. Then, while turning a corner, I suddenly ran into another man. He screamed and ran off in a different direction before I could say anything to him. Making my way up the hill toward my home, I fell over something heavy and soft. Getting back on my feet and turning around, I found that it was a body. It was laying on its stomach, with its head bent far forward, too far forward, in fact. I picked up my courage and turned the body over on its back. It was too dark and rainy to see anything clearly, but then another lightning flash pierced the clouds, revealing the identity of the fallen man. It was the pub owner, whose only means of escape I had run off with. Continuing up the hill, I noticed that most of the houses remained unharmed. However, the college near my home, as well as the church, was burning brightly in the night. When I finally reached my home, I heard the sound of people yelling and running. I quickly unlocked my door and ran inside. I did not feel safe being around large groups of people now. I simply sat down on the floor, with my back to the wall, shaking with cold and fear. Chapter 11. The Artilleryman. I'm not sure how long I sat there. Judging by the pools of water gathered around me, it must have been at least an hour. I got up and immediately got myself a glass of whiskey. Then I headed upstairs to my office. I was still a little out of my mind at the moment, and was doing things without being aware of any purpose. When I got to the office, I found that the window had been left open. Outside, I could see that the storm had died down, and beyond the remains of the college that once stood across from my home, I could make out large black Martian figures moving about the red glow of the sand pits, making further preparations of some sort. The air that came through my window had the sharp smell of burning wood. From this window I had a view of the area from Walking train station to the northwestern woods that had been bombed earlier and was now still smoking from the devastation. At the station, I noticed a train had been destroyed. The yellow engine lay on its side, surrounded by flames. The whole countryside looked to be on fire as well. I could not believe that this was my home, a place I had thought to be the safest in the world. I sat down in my office chair and studied the scene out the window, especially the sandpits. the machine-like Martians appeared to be working incredibly hard. I wondered if they were actual living things or if they were just machines driven about by Martians inside. As I sat there thinking, a sound came from my garden area. I jumped up from my chair and carefully stuck my head out the window. Down below, I caught sight of an army soldier, another human being. I made a hissing sound to try to get his attention. The sound frightened him for a moment, but he calmed down when I whispered, "Where are you going?" "I'm looking for a place to hide," he whispered back. "Wait there, I'll come let you in," I told him. I ran downstairs, unlocked the door, and pulled him quickly inside. I immediately took him to the dining area and gave him a drink of whiskey. "They killed everyone, the whole army," he cried softly. It took a while for him to calm down. When he finally did, he explained that he was a gunman in the military. He said that the fighting started as soon as his artillery had arrived. The Martians were moving toward their second fallen ship under a metal covering, which protected them from the army's bullets. Then, a short time later, the metal cover stood up on its 3 legs and showed itself to be a Martian fighting machine. It began to fire upon everything around it. He had been lucky, for his horse accidentally stepped into a hole in the field and fell. Just then, the gun behind him exploded, and all kinds of metal and body parts came crashing down around him. He laid, caught underneath his horse, for hours, too afraid to move. He watched the Martian machine as it walked about the fields, killing every living thing it could find. He noticed that the heat ray came from a long box with flashing green lights that it carried in one of its arms. He said that he was sure he was the only survivor. As soon as it had finished with the military, the machine walked over to the town of Woking and used its heat ray to destroy homes and finally the train station. Then, as it walked off toward the northwestern woods, a second machine came walking out from the trees. The 2 machines walked away from Woking, and I slowly crawled away from the field and made my way into the town to look for anyone who might be alive. Sadly, all that I found were burned bodies or parts of bodies. The only time I did see a living man, he was running from one of the machines that had returned to the village. The machine caught him in one of its arms and smashed his head into a tree. I hid within the ruins of one of the homes. When night came, I ran for Maybury, hoping to slowly make my way to London. He said that he had found some survivors hiding in Maybury. Many of them were waiting for a good opportunity to escape further away from Woking and the glowing sandpits. I then went into the kitchen and got some food for the soldier and me to eat. He was very hungry and thirsty. We both ate in the darkness for fear that a light might attract the Martian's attention. Outside, we heard the sounds of people quietly running away. After we had finished eating, we both went up to my study and looked out the window. The sun was just starting to rise. At the pits, 3 huge machines stood looking about the destruction they had brought to the area. All around them, the land lay blackened and smoking from the dying fires. Chapter 12. The Attack on Weybridge. The soldier and I agreed that it would not be wise to remain at my home. He felt that the best thing would be for him to continue to make his way toward London, with the hope of joining his military unit. I, on the other hand, decided to go back to Leatherhead to get my wife and take her away from England. The only problem was that there was a Martian pit between here and Leatherhead. The soldier convinced me that it would be better to travel together through the northern woods, and then separate at Chobham Road, where I would then head for the town of Epsom, which neighbored Leatherhead. Before going, we gathered as much food and drink as we could. Then we set out on the same road I had taken to return from Leatherhead. As we ran, most of the houses seemed untouched in this area. Then we began to find many dead bodies along the road, along with broken carriages and scattered household items. We seemed to be the only living beings in the area. Everyone else had either died or escaped, as I earlier had. When we reached the woods, we found that most of its trees had fallen. Those left standing were burned black, and its branches stood either naked or dressed in browned leaves. The morning was strangely silent. Not a bird could be heard anywhere. Then, through the stillness, came the sound of horses' hooves. Through the remaining trees, we saw 3 soldiers walking along a narrow road toward Woking. We shouted to them, and they stopped to wait for us. One of the soldiers was a lieutenant, so my companion saluted him before speaking. "We lost everyone, sir. I'm trying to get back to my unit now, sir." "Can you tell me about these Martians?" the lieutenant asked. "Well, sir, they're huge, metal creatures that kill with guns that shoot fire," my companion explained. "Oh, come on. You expect me to believe that?" "He's not lying," I said. "If you keep walking, you'll find them less than a half a mile from here." "Well, we're here to clear people out of their homes. You'd better report to General Marvin in Weybridge. You know where that is?" "Yes, I do," I answered. We then left them and moved on toward the town of Byfleet. When we came from out of the woods there, everything seemed calm and quiet. Only the sight of military men and the sounds of people gathering their household things onto wagons indicated that this day was different from others. In one of the fields, we could see a small collection of soldiers waiting patiently with large guns pointed toward Woking. "These guys have no idea how useless those guns are. They've never seen that Martian fire gun," my companion said. It was clear that no one in this town knew how serious the situation really was. One man was arguing with a soldier who had told him to leave his plants behind. He was demanding that he be allowed to take them with him. I walked up to the man and took hold of his arm. "You have no idea what's beyond those trees, do you?" The man just looked at me, his eyes wide with surprise. "No one over there is alive. No one. And you'll be just as dead if you don't forget about these damned flowers of yours," I shouted, and then walked away. The town was full of people wearing their nice Sunday clothing, gathering their things onto wagons, with much excitement. It seemed almost entertaining to them, for many of them were smiling and laughing. The train stations were terribly crowded with people and boxes. As the day went on, I am told that the situation became a bit violent, with people pushing and fighting each other in order to get aboard. We stayed in Weybridge until mid-afternoon and ate the lunch we had gathered from my home and helped a few people to load their goods onto wagons. Then we walked down to the river, an area of town called Shepperton. Here, people were crowded together trying to get aboard a number of the boats that would carry them across the river to the other shore. I was surprised to see all of the household things people were trying to escape with. It was as if they thought the Martians would want to steal their things. Across the water, it looked much calmer. The hotel there seemed to be closed, and the ferry was just dropping off a load of people. Then I heard someone shout at a dog to shut up. Immediately, the sound of a distant explosion could be heard. One of the guns had been fired. It seemed that the fighting had begun. Many other guns fired soon after. No one could see the battle, for it was taking place on the other side of the forest. Everyone stood and listened, trying to determine what was happening.
"It's okay. They won't get past those soldiers,"
I heard a woman say. Then, further down the river, there was a huge explosion that sent both earth and water flying high up into the air. Everyone stood motionless and disbelieving. "Oh my God! There they are!" a voice cried out. And there they were, indeed, 4 of those huge killing machines moving as quickly as birds coming straight for the river. They were coming from the plains to the left of the forest that hid the military from our eyes. The people stood in shock. Then everyone suddenly began to turn and run, not caring who or what might be in their way. I myself was knocked over by the end of a table one man carried on his back. Struggling to get to my feet, I could hear the sound of water splashing as people jumped from the side of the boats. Then I remembered the Martian's heat ray and got an idea. I began to shout for everyone to jump into the water. Then I jumped in and waded out to the middle of the river. The water was not very deep. I could still stand with my chest above the water. Many followed my advice and immediately ran into the river. The sound of splashing water was so loud that I was completely surprised when I looked up, only to find the Martians almost right on top of us. Right away, I dove down underwater. When I could no longer hold my breath, I came up for air and saw that one of the Martians was preparing to shoot its heat ray into the trees where the military lay hidden. But as soon as it raised its arm, I could hear the sound of 6 guns firing at the same time. All around the head of the machine, shells exploded in the air. Bang! 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 Then a 4th shell came racing directly in the face of the machine and knocked its head almost completely off. A direct hit. Half of the monster's head was blown off, revealing the inside control area. From where I stood, I could see the destroyed body of the Martian, which had been operating the metal machine. The huge weapon now walked about without a brain and wandered clumsily about the shore of the river. One of its arms blindly destroyed the rooftop of the Shepperton Church, and then the metal monster came stumbling back down the riverbank and fell face first into the water. The river rose up in waves, and the water quickly heated to an almost painful temperature. People started running out of the river, but I was too happy at having seen the destruction of the monster to care about myself. Then, from behind, I heard a man scream a warning. "Look out!" I turned and saw the other Martians coming. I went underwater again. The water grew even hotter, and the surface above me seemed to be under attack. When I came back up, the air was filled with steam. I could just barely see the 3 Martians only 200 meters away, standing near their fallen comrade. One seemed to be trying to repair the machine, while the other 2 were protecting it by standing on either side of it, firing their heat rays in all directions. All around me, the sound of total destruction pounded upon my ears. Houses, trees, wagons, all were being burned. Those that had not yet been touched seemed to calmly wait for their certain death. The people who had followed me into the river were all now trying to escape from it, for the water was getting hotter and hotter by the second. Then a heat ray came shooting toward me. I began to swim toward the shore. The water was becoming unbearable. As the ray approached, it brought with it a huge wave of boiling water. I swam as quickly as I could, but the wave came crashing down upon me, and I screamed in terrible pain. With my last strength, I pulled myself ashore, right out in front of the Martians. I remember the foot of one of the machines coming within a few meters of stepping on my head. It then raised its foot and with its huge stride stepped onward with its companions. I watched, amazed to still be alive, as the 3 machines carried their fallen comrade off into the distance, far down the river. Chapter 13. I Meet the Curate. Having realized the ability of humans to defend themselves, the Martians returned to their base camp in the sandpits. In their hurry to return with their damaged machine, the Martians failed to kill everyone in Shepperton. Had they not troubled with their fallen companion and gone on toward London, they would have found it quite easy. The military had not yet gathered its units and guns. London would surely have been just as devastated as Lisbon 100 years ago after its earthquake. Now, however, the military was quickly pulling itself together and gaining strength. Guns were hidden within every neighborhood of every little village. Even among the ruins of previously destroyed areas, soldiers were in place, waiting to signal their comrades for the next attack. Unfortunately, the Martians were also gaining in strength and numbers. Every 24 hours, a new group of falling cylinders came crashing into Earth. As for the Martians in walking, they had moved all of their equipment from the other two camps to the sandpits and were working, without stop, to prepare for their next advance. I, in the meantime, struggled to make my way to London through the smoking ruins of Weybridge. I found a small boat floating in the river and jumped inside. It had no paddles, so I was forced to use my hands. Each time I stroked the water, a terrible pain ran through my burned body. The towns along the river were all burned to the ground, and the surrounding countryside was full of little fires here and there. Occasionally, I could see the shadows of people running through the trees away from Weybridge. I had lost my shirt, and the sun was shining painfully down on my backside. I tried to rest for a moment, but fear took control again and forced me to paddle some more. When I came to a bridge at Middlesex, I got out of the boat and started to walk. I made it only a mile before needing to lie down in the tall grass at the side of the road. I had not seen anybody anywhere. I must have slept, because I remember opening my eyes and seeing a man standing nearby and looking up into the sky, which at the time was a beautiful blue and red sunset. I quickly got to my feet and addressed him. "You haven't any water, have you?" He did not. His rather big blue eyes looked tired, almost hopeless. "What is all of this?" he asked, indicating the surrounding destruction. "What have we done to deserve this? Who are they to take all of this away from us?" "But then again, who are we to have it?" I responded. I was not really in the mood to start a deep conversation, but I could not help asking this, not just of this man, but of myself as well. He remained silent for a moment. "Everything we worked so hard for here in Weybridge is gone. Our church, the one we just rebuilt, gone in a matter of minutes." I did not know what to say to him. It was apparent now that he was an assistant to the local priest, a curate. I asked him if the town of Sunbury was nearby, but he only went on asking the same kinds of unanswerable questions. Is there no hope? Has the earth been given to these horrible beings? I could see that he was starting to go mad. I tried to encourage him to pull himself together. "We still have hope," I said. "God is punishing us. That is what it is. He's punishing us for all of our sins. We were warned not to sin, but did that stop us? Not in the slightest. And now it is as clear as day. God has become tired of man and has decided to rid himself of them. Other places in the world have been destroyed by earthquakes and terrible storms. Is your town of Weybridge any different from those places? It shares the same earth, and it will do as they have done. It will adapt and rebuild itself. But those Things cannot be destroyed, he cried out. Ah, but I just saw one get killed earlier today. I saw it with my own 2 eyes. Now, over there in that direction, the Martians are at work, while up this way our military is preparing to fight. Wait, quiet, he said suddenly. Far away the sound of guns could be heard going off, along with a strange crying sound. It was a little similar to the cry of a siren that warns people of an approaching enemy. Let's get going, I said. North is where we want to be. Chapter 14, London. At the time of the Martian landing in Woking, my brother was studying medicine in London. He did not hear the news, however, for he was preparing for an examination, and the newspapers did not give any indication that there was terrible danger. The paper had only said that some people had been killed after their approach frightened the Martians. In addition to lots of articles about Mars and life on other planets, there was a message from Woking printed that read, "Martians, although very powerful, cannot seem to move from their pit due to the strong force of gravity." So the feeling in London was one of general curiosity and nothing more. People did not connect the cutting of telegraph lines and the disruption of train services with the landing of the Martians. The problem with the news reports was that they were written by people who had not seen the Martians. Therefore, their descriptions of events were incorrect. London people seemed to think that the Martians were incredibly slow and under terrible pain from the Earth's atmosphere. The result being that when reports of whole towns, like Woking, being destroyed and entire military units being killed, Londoners tended to read it without much worry or feeling. They were safe, they thought, so everything was okay. Train services became increasingly disorganized. Bits of news kept arriving. Weybridge residents had left their town and were heading toward London. Fighting had begun around the town of Weybridge. All the information was without detail. My brother, after reading reports in the Referee that the town of Woking had been destroyed, began to worry about my safety. He went to the train station to see if there was any way to reach me. Only a few trains were still running. One of the passengers from Kingston approached my brother, saying, "You wouldn't believe all the people coming to Kingston in wagons loaded with their personal things. We were told that the Martians were coming this way. In fact, we heard guns being fired outside of Hampton Court Station. What's happening? I thought that the Martians couldn't leave their pit." Soon, trucks full of soldiers and guns began to arrive at the station. Then the police came and cleared the people from the train platforms. Reports came that a body, terribly burned, had been found floating in the river, along with some strange brown-colored matter. One of the soldiers said that he had seen warning lights flashing in the distance from the western edge of town. Leaving the station, my brother walked out under an incredibly peaceful golden sky. He ran into 3 newspaper boys who ran about town screaming the latest news of the horror in Weybridge. My brother got a copy of the paper, and it was at this moment that he realized just how terrible the situation truly was. The reports were now much more accurate. The Martians were now described as highly intelligent beings that were operating huge metallic spider-like machines that could move as quickly as the fastest train. It told of the destruction of one of the machines and the following destruction of an entire unit of military. 116 of the largest guns available were now being placed around London in preparation for their coming. It also said that the military was prepared to destroy any newly arriving Martian ships as soon as they touched Earth. They instructed the people not to worry too much, for there were, at most, only 20 Martians compared to the millions of humans that lived in the area. They assured the people that the military would be able to protect them from any possible danger, and that, in the event that the Martians did come, the people would be informed early enough for them to escape. Everyone ran out into the streets to get their own copy of the paper. All of London was now excited by the news. As my brother walked along the Strand, he saw some people from Surrey who had just escaped their town, pulling a cart with their household things on it. They looked tired and troubled. Their clothing was a terrible mess. Everyone on the street watched them as they made their confused way among the busy traffic. Further down the road, my brother ran into many more of these people who had escaped from the surrounding countryside. He thought that it might be possible to find me among the crowd. A large number of policemen had been assigned to guide these Sunday visitors along the streets to safe houses, and the people kept coming in greater and greater numbers all day and night long. My brother attempted to get some news of walking from them, but no one seemed to know anything. One man did, however, tell him that the little town was burned completely to the ground the night before. Soon, a feeling began to run among the people of London that the military and government were not doing a good enough job of taking care of these Martians. For the coming of all these countryside people was causing lots of problems. At around 8 that evening, as my brother passed through one of the quieter back streets, he heard the sound of guns being fired from the southern end of the city. He quickly headed back to his home in Regent's Park, full of worries about my safety. He tried to imagine these spider-like Martians and their deadly heat rays. On his way back, he could see that people were still taking their evening walks, but they were in groups now, chatting away about the recent news. At home, he sat thinking and listening to the sound of guns in the distance. After many attempts to take his mind off of things, by returning to his studies, he finally laid down after midnight to try and get some sleep. Later, in the darkness of early morning, my brother was awakened by the sound of people banging on doors and drums being played somewhere down the road. He lay there momentarily in shock, wondering what was happening. He then jumped to his feet and ran to the window. Outside, policemen were rushing door to door, screaming, "They're getting closer! The Martians will soon be here!" Church bells started ringing all around the neighborhood in an effort to wake everyone up. The door to the next room suddenly opened behind my brother, and his flatmate came walking into the room looking confused. "What's happening out there?" he said, joining my brother at the window. "I'm not quite sure, actually," my brother responded. "Something about Martians." The two of them stood for a moment, both of their heads out of the window, trying to understand the shouts of the policemen. Then my brother began to get dressed while keeping an eye outside the window. Newspaper sellers came running around the corner, shouting the latest headlines. "Military units totally destroyed in the Thames Valley." This was to be the beginning of London's great fear. The entire city had gone to bed that Sunday evening without a worry, and woken up early Monday morning to a horrible feeling of danger. My brother stepped outside his apartment at around sunrise and found the streets filling more and more with running people. There were shouts of "smoke" from the newspaper sellers who still sold their papers instead of just giving them away. My brother took a paper from him and threw some coins at him as he ran away. On the front page was a message from the highest military leader. Martians have completely destroyed Richmond, Wimbledon, and Kingston, and are gradually approaching London. They are using a deadly black gas to kill entire units of our military. There is no way to stop them. The only way for Londoners to survive is by leaving the city immediately. Soon the whole city of London would be running in the streets in an attempt to escape to the north. My brother then ran back to his apartment and gathered all of the money he could find, and then ran back out into the street to run for his life. Chapter 15. A new Martian weapon is introduced. At the same moment that I met the curate, my brother joined the escaping crowd of Londoners. The Martians had come from out of their pit in Woking to renew their attacks on our civilization. 3 of them emerged at 8 o'clock, while the others continued their work. The whole day they had apparently been working on something inside the pit, sending large billows of green smoke mysteriously into the air. Finally, at about 9 o'clock, they finished their work and began to follow the earlier line of attackers in their horrible killing machines. They attacked in a wide line, maybe 1.5 miles from one another. And their means of communication was a loud cry that often changed pitch. This was the strange sound that the curate and I had heard earlier in the day. The first defensive line that the machines met was made up of inexperienced volunteers who should not have been placed at the front of the battle. None of the men in the unit had ever fired a gun under the threat of also being fired upon. Seeing the approaching machines, they became terribly frightened and began to shoot at them too early, missing them completely. The Martians now knew exactly where the unit had been hiding and turned their weapons in their direction. The entire unit began running away. However, the Martians moved quickly and crushed every man under their feet. This easy win allowed the Martians to surprise the next line of defense and quickly defeat them in battle as well. The soldiers at St. George's Hill had a bit more success. They took one Martian by surprise and blew off one of its legs, causing the machine to fall hard to the ground. From the victim came a long, loud cry. This brought 2 other machines into the area to help. The soldiers tried to take them down as well, but missed. This, of course, gave away their hiding place, and the 2 Martian machines attacked with incredible violence. They fired their heat rays upon the poor unit and killed most of them within just a few seconds. Only 2 men were able to make it over the hillside and survive the attack. It was reported that the 2 fighting machines then returned to the injured one and stood on either side of it, standing guard. Moments later, the Martian which had been operating the fallen machine came out slowly and painfully from the head. It carried in its arms several tools that it then used to repair the damaged leg. Within a half an hour, the fallen machine was back on its feet, walking onward with its 2 companions. Not long after, they met up with 4 other Martian machines that were carrying long black tubes. Soon, all 7 Martian machines had tubes, and they then spread out in a 12-mile-long half-circle. 2 of the machines came very near to the place where the curate and I were hiding. My companion made a small, frightened sound in his throat and then began to run. I, however, knowing the uselessness of running from the Martians, ran into the tall grass at the side of the road and hid in a ditch. The curate noticed this and decided that my idea might be the better one. He ran back and joined me in the ditch. The 2 machines stood there silently, one facing Staines, one facing Sunbury, for what seemed like hours. The Martians were no longer communicating with their strange musical cries. Now everything was quiet as the Martians stared toward London, and the military sat hiding somewhere out there with their guns at the ready. Looking at the Martians standing there, it seemed that they had already won, and that everything under the moon and sun was theirs. They looked unbeatable in their giant metal machines. I began to feel no bigger or stronger than an insect. Then the sound of a large army gun broke the silence. The Martian facing Staines had been shot at, but was missed. It then raised its long tube-like gun and fired an incredibly loud shot into the distance. The one facing Staines then did the same. Each time they shot their guns, the ground shook violently, but no smoke or fire came from the tube. We sat waiting for the military to respond, but all that we heard was some shouting followed by dead silence. The machine then began walking east along the river without being fired at once. It soon disappeared into the distance. "What's going on?" asked the curate. "I have no idea," I responded. We both climbed up out of our ditch to have a look around. Over the trees and to the north and east, mysterious black clouds seemed to have formed. Not a single human sound came from any direction. The only thing we could hear were the cries of the Martians in the southeast as they communicated with one another. I learned, later on, that what had happened was that the Martians fired their guns into every possible hiding place in the surrounding area. Groups of trees, hilly land, and closely built buildings. Their guns shot large containers that broke open when they hit the ground and released a thick black gas, which then spread quickly through the air and immediately killed anything that breathed it in. Fortunately, the gas was very heavy and could only rise to a certain height before starting to fall slowly to the ground, where it would lay in thick, dusty clumps. I say fortunately because there were some who had hidden high up in the tops of trees or on the highest floor of their home where the gas could not climb. They waited there for days until the gas fell completely to the ground, and the Martians came through and cleaned it up by shooting steam upon the ground with a special machine. I suppose that I should not call it cleaning up, for the black dust remained. It, however, lost its poisonous effect. The curate and I watched them do this from the window of an empty house in Upper Halliford. For the rest of the night, the Martians continued to move forward toward London in their ever-widening half-circle, shooting their containers into every possible hiding place in their path. Not a single soldier or citizen that had sat waiting for the Martians between St. George's Hill and London survived that night. Before sunrise, the black gas had already arrived in Richmond. The leaders in London responded by ordering its citizens to leave the city as quickly as they could, for the Martians would soon be there. Chapter 16. A Mad Crowd. The people of London went crazy on Monday morning. Everyone tried to escape to the north or the east on their feet, by boat or by train. It was only a matter of hours before the police and railways were made helpless. Everywhere, people were fighting each other for a place on an escaping train or boat. In the streets, police had become so angry about the surrounding craziness that they started beating the people they had been ordered to help. By noon, the black clouds had floated into several areas of the city. My brother, meanwhile, had been lucky enough to be one of the first to arrive at a bicycle store. He rode his way through the crowd of people outside of the shop and made his way toward Edgware. Almost 3/4 of the way there, his bicycle's front tire went flat, making the bike almost completely impossible to ride. He managed to walk the rest of the way. When he finally arrived at the little village, he saw the residents there standing outside their doors, watching in disbelief as more and more people from London arrived. After getting a bite to eat at a local hotel, my brother decided to head toward the town of Chelmsford, where some friends of his lived. He took a path to the northeast and walked for several miles without seeing anyone. However, as he was walking near High Barnet, he began to hear the sound of women screaming. He immediately ran to where the screams were coming from and found 3 men trying to steal a horse and wagon from 2 women. 2 of the men were holding the women, while the 3rd man was attempting to lead the horse away. My brother, being an excellent fighter, ran at one of the men and hit him in the face. The man let go of the woman he was holding and tried to come back at my brother. However, he had no time for my brother, beat him down to the ground. My brother then turned and grabbed hold of the other woman's attacker. She too was let go. However, before my brother could take care of him, the 3rd man hit him square in the face. The 2nd man then managed to escape from my brother's hold. It was now 2 against 1. The 2 women got into their wagon and started driving quickly away. My brother, seeing that he was now in trouble, started to run after them. Behind him, the 2 remaining men also came running as well. The wagon was moving much too fast for my brother to catch, and his vision was still a little unclear from the blow he had just received to his face. The 2 men were just about to catch up to him when, luckily, one of the women stopped the wagon and jumped back down to the ground with a gun in her hand. She fired once, just barely missing my brother, and frightened the 2 thieves into running away. The woman walked my brother back to her wagon and helped him into it. The 3 of them then drove on, not knowing exactly where they were going. My brother learned that they were the wife and sister of a doctor in the town of Stanmore, who, after hearing about the coming Martians, put them in the wagon, gave them his gun, and told them to ride to Edgware and catch a train. He was supposed to meet them that morning in Edgware, but he never arrived. The 2 women, seeing the growing crowds in town, decided to forget the train and started off in the direction that my brother found them. My brother agreed to stay with them until they were safe and tried to comfort them by saying that he was excellent with a gun, which was not at all true. They welcomed his company and appreciated the help he had given them with the 3 thieves they had unexpectedly encountered. The women suggested catching a train at St. Albans, but my brother disagreed due to the dangerous crowds that were killing one another in order to escape. My brother thought it would be better to try and leave the country entirely by going toward Essex. After some arguing with the doctor's wife, Mrs. Elphinstone, the 3 finally agreed to follow my brother's plan and drove on toward Barnet. Along the way, as they came closer to the town, they began to see more people about. One man seemed totally out of his mind, talking to himself and swinging his fists about wildly to fight off Martians that were not there. Then they passed a wagon carrying 3 pitiful young factory girls. Their faces were dirty from either the job or their escape. It was hard to know. Barnet was on fire when they arrived, and as they came to the main road that passed through the town from London, they found a huge crowd of people, all pushing one another in an attempt to escape to the north. This road crossed the path my brother and his newfound partners were trying to follow. Mrs. Elphinstone became quite frightened by the destruction of the town and the sight of all the escaping people. Everyone looked weak and terrified. Many were crying as they passed them on the road. When my brother turned around to look back toward London, he saw a sea of people without end. It was unbelievable. The crowd was a very cruel and dangerous one. People who had horses and carriages at every opportunity tried to force their way through the people in front of them. Men and women were pushed to the ground in painful cries. "Get out of the way!" they would shout. "Hurry up! The Martians will soon be here!" The people and the horses all looked hungry and thirsty. It seemed at any moment they might drop to the ground from weakness. However, fear pushed them forward, every single one of them. And there were people of all sorts in this crowd. Injured soldiers, barely able to walk. Workers, some helpful, while others mean and thoughtless. Old women with crying young children. Kind and cruel people alike, all thrown together in this endless stream of bodies. At one point, my brother, having passed a little girl crying out for her mother, went and picked her up and brought her back to the wagon. Then a cry came from somewhere in the crowd.
"Ellen! Ellen!"
And the little girl stood up at once and jumped from the wagon and into the arms of a crying young woman. Then something terrible happened. The bag of a man walking behind my brother suddenly broke open, and all kinds of coins fell to the ground. The man stopped, frightened of losing his money, and was struck on the head from behind by the board of a wagon. He fell to the ground and was pushed out of the way by a couple of men. A moment later, the man ran back into the crowd and jumped upon the money, trying to collect as much of it in his pockets as he could. Then someone yelled, "Move! Out of the way!" And a large carriage came upon the man there. My brother yelled for the carriage to stop, but of course it did not. Seconds later, the man's back was crushed under one of the carriage wheels. My brother, with the help of another carriage driver, moved the poor victim out of the way of the crowd. As they were carrying him, the injured man yelled horrible insults at my brother and tried to free himself in order to get back to his money. Then the carriage of the man who was helping my brother was struck from behind by another impatient wagon. This frightened the horse pulling the front carriage and made it begin to rise up on its back feet. As my brother looked up and prepared to move out of the way of the wild horse, the man with the money bit my brother's hand, causing my brother to drop him. My brother, having no other choice, rolled out of the way of the approaching danger, while the man who bit him fell under the stomping feet of the horse and the wheels of the carriage it pulled. Cries of terror passed through the crowd as the man was trampled to death. My brother then returned to the two women and suggested that they turn around, for it seemed hopeless to try and cross the road through this desperate gathering of people. After going only 100 yards back in the direction they had just come, my brother realized the importance of keeping his original plan. It was really their only hope for staying alive. So, once again, they turned back toward the crowd and fought their way through all the people to the other side of the road, my brother bravely stopping traffic on his feet, while the doctor's sister attempted to drive the carriage past the angry line of people. The man whose carriage my brother prevented from moving began to strike him with his whip, while his carriage crashed into the side of their wagon, pushing it sideways. My brother jumped back onto the wagon and told the doctor's sister to aim her gun at the man's horse. "If he pushes us any further, shoot," he said. Eventually they made it through, but not before being pushed almost a full mile north. They then continued their journey eastward. They drove on late into the evening until hunger and sleepiness finally caught up with them, forcing them to stop and rest somewhere along the roadside. Chapter 17. A Heroic Ship. If a person had been able to fly in a balloon high above London that Monday afternoon and evening, he would have seen the same kind of traffic of people along every road that led north and east out of London. All 6 million residents of London, those anyway who were not already dead, were escaping along those narrow roads, each person terribly afraid for his life. If the person in the balloon looked to the south of London, he would have found that it was entirely covered in something like black ink. If the Martians had intended to kill all 6 million of London's people, they very easily could have. However, it seemed that they wanted only to take complete control over humans and prevent them from fighting back. They cut off our every means of effective transportation and communication. 2 more stars soon fell, one in Wimbledon, and the other of which I am about to tell. But first, Wimbledon. My brother and his 2 companions saw that one hit the ground. By this time, it was widely understood that London was under the Martians' complete control. Up until this time, my brother had never seen a Martian. This, however, would soon change. My brother ran into many people along his escape to the eastern coast. From these people he heard many rumors, the most attractive one being that northern towns had gotten together and prepared enough bread to feed the millions of starving people heading their way. There was also word going around that traps were being set for the Martians around the city of London. Bombs were being buried in the surrounding fields to take the enemy by surprise should they decide to move on beyond the capital. The first bit of news interested my brother more, for he was terribly hungry. But even so, he convinced his 2 companions to continue to move toward the east, and for the next day they heard no more about such rumors. That evening, Mrs. Elphinstone saw the 7th star fall from the sky. They had been stopped in a field earlier in the evening by a group of people who called themselves the People's Supply Committee. They took the 2 women's horse from them, but promised that they would be paid for it in food the next day. Despite such promises, my brother once again encouraged the women to keep up their eastward journey toward the ocean that night. After seeing the 7th Martian ship arrive, the arguing stopped and the 3 of them walked on. The next day, in the early afternoon, they arrived at Tillingham, where the sea suddenly came into view. The ocean there was filled with ships of all sorts. Ships full of cattle, ships full of fuel, passenger boats, and one military boat, the Thunder Child. It stood there looking mighty, despite its inability to help the fall of London. Behind it could be seen the smoke of many more military ships, for the ships themselves were hidden in a low mist that lay just above the surface of the water. They almost seemed ghost-like out there in the quiet distance. The doctor's sister and I began to walk eagerly toward the beach down below, but Mrs. Elphinstone did not want to leave England, and refused to take another step forward. She feared life abroad almost as much as she feared the Martians. She wanted to go back to her hometown of Stanmore. Everything would be okay there, she said. My brother and the doctor's sister had to pull her down to the beach by both arms. Once there, my brother was able to get the attention of a nearby ship that sent a small boat to get them. They soon found themselves safely on board, but in order to stay, they had to pay the captain £36. There was food available on the ship, although it also was not free, but rather quite expensive. Then the sound of guns could be heard from the south. Slowly, the hidden military boats started to come out from behind the mist and move toward land. Meanwhile, my brother's boat had just begun to move out toward sea. The sound of the guns became louder and louder until finally a Martian appeared in the distance. The captain of the ship yelled at his boat to go faster, but the poor thing was already going full speed. As the Martian reached the beach and walked into the water after the retreating boats, another Martian suddenly appeared and joined it in the chase. This was the first Martian my brother had ever seen. He watched in amazement as it came for them, followed by one, then another, and yet another Martian. There must have been 5 or 6 of them altogether. His boat was making very slow progress, but my brother was too shocked to be frightened. Suddenly, he was knocked off of his feet as the boat made a quick, sharp turn in order to avoid being hit by another ship. When he got back to his feet, my brother saw that his boat had just barely avoided running into the Thunder Child. That ship was designed to destroy boats by crashing into them, and it was now heading full speed for the Martians. My brother watched as the ship came closer and closer to the Martians. No one could believe that it got as close as it did, for the Martians could certainly have used their heat ray to destroy it. However, this boat did not fire at them. Instead, it came upon them with great speed, its size making them look less frightening. The front Martian finally shot a container of gas at the ship, but it simply bounced off the side and fell into the water. The huge iron ship kept coming. The Martian then raised its heat ray and shot a stream of terrible fire into the side of the oncoming boat. Great damage was done to the Thunder Child. However, it could not stop its forward motion, and moments later, the boat hit the Martian directly and sent it reeling backward. The giant Martian machine tried to stay on its legs, but failed and fell face first into the water, where it quickly sank to the bottom. Everyone aboard my brother's ship let out a loud cheer, but they became even more excited when they saw that the great boat was still okay and now heading directly for a second Martian. "They're going after another one!" yelled our captain. Everyone screamed with joy. My brother could not control himself and let out a triumphant cry. The Martian shot its heat ray at the charging boat, and a whole section of the Thunder Child exploded. But again, it was not enough to stop the boat's approach, and within seconds, the Martian was struck so hard that it looked as though it were made of nothing more than paper. The fighting machine broke right in half, its legs disappearing into the water below, while the giant head came crashing down soon after. "They got him!" cried the captain. Again, cheers from all around. After the steam and smoke had cleared, the Thunder Child was nowhere to be seen. However, none of the Martians could be seen either. It seemed that they had run away. The other military boats were now close to the shore, ready to fight the Martians with all of their strength. So encouraged were they by the Thunder Child's success. My brother's boat continued its journey further out to sea. As night slowly approached, and my brother sat listening to the gunfire in the distance, the captain suddenly shouted, pointing his finger at the sky. At that moment, a thin, round object could be seen flying with great speed up into the darkness above. It rose higher and higher until it finally disappeared, leaving nothing but the sound of water slapping against the side of the boat, carrying my brother and his companions safely away from the Martians. Chapter 18. The Fifth Cylinder. If you will remember, the curate and I were in an empty house in Halliford, hiding from the Martians, who had just begun to fire their black containers of gas upon the military. There we stayed for 2 whole days, Sunday and Monday, unable to leave due to the black gas that surrounded us. With nothing to do and nowhere to go, I began to worry about my wife in Leatherhead. I imagined her terribly frightened and sad. She must have assumed that I was long dead. This made me even more upset. I did my best to calm myself, thinking that the Martians probably left Leatherhead untouched, due to their concentration on central London. I hoped that this was true. The curate, meanwhile, was making me crazy with all of his useless talk about God's punishment and how hopeless things were. I tried staying away from him in order to get some peace and quiet, but he would soon follow me into whatever room I went to. Finally, I locked myself inside the attic. Outside, the black gas gradually came closer and closer to our house, where we remained as high up as possible. Then, one of the Martians came and cleaned up the gas with his steam gun, which, when sprayed about, did damage of its own by breaking windows and burning the hands of the curate, who had been stupidly standing about in the front room instead of hiding. When the Martian had finished, I woke up from my sadness, realizing that it was now possible to get away. The curate did not want to leave. He felt safe in the house. I, however, was determined to go, and I set about gathering as much food as I could. When I was ready to go, the curate suddenly realized that I meant to leave him alone. He quickly changed his mind about staying and followed me out the door and down the road toward Sunbury. Along the road lay hundreds of bodies burnt beyond recognition. Everything was covered in heavy black dust. It reminded me of what I had read about the famous city of Pompeii when it was destroyed by a volcano. However, the further we got from Halliford, the more grass and trees we began to see. By the time we arrived in Twickenham, there was no black dust to be seen anywhere, nor any bodies or destruction. However, the area was empty of people. As we pushed on, eventually crossing the Richmond Bridge, around 8 o'clock that evening, we found ourselves once again following the path of the Martians. Buildings were burning all about us, and bodies were lying randomly about the streets. Nearing Kew, we caught sight of some people running down a narrow road. Then, suddenly, behind them appeared the large round head of a Martian fighting machine. The curate and I immediately ran into a wooden hut nearby. As soon as the danger passed, I carefully walked back out into the street and continued on toward Kew. The curate, who had been crying in a corner of the hut, came running after me. Within a few minutes, we saw another Martian in a field off to our right. At its feet were about 5 or 6 people running about trying to get away from it. The Martian grabbed all of them with its snake-like arms and placed them in a metal basket that hung on its backside. This was the first time I had seen this happen, and it made me think that the Martians might have something else in mind other than the total destruction of the human race. The curate and I ran away as quickly as we could until we both blindly fell into a deep ditch, where we stayed until the darkness of night fell. Martians seemed to be everywhere around us, although none of them knew of our presence in the ditch. At around 11 that night, we finally decided to leave the hole in the ground and get back on the road. We stayed in the shadows and stuck to the sides of the streets in order not to be seen. When we arrived in Sheen, the curate was almost ready to fall from hunger. We decided to try one of the houses. We were unlucky in our first attempt at finding food. The house we tried had nothing but a little water for us to drink. The second house, however, was perfect. It had a large kitchen with a storage room attached. We broke the lock on the storage room door and entered. Inside, we found a large amount of canned food, as well as bottles of beer and wine. We could not believe our luck. Immediately, we brought out some of the beer and bread and sat down in the kitchen for a good meal. As we sat chatting away and eating, a green light came suddenly shining through the windows and brightened the whole kitchen. The light then quickly disappeared and was followed by the sound of an explosion, and the house windows all exploded and everything seemed to come falling down around us. I do not know for how long I was unconscious, but I woke up to the curate standing over me, wiping my head with a wet towel. There was a large, fresh cut above his eyes. I tried to sit up, but the curate took hold of me with both of his hands. "There's too much broken glass around us," he whispered. "If you move, the Martians will surely hear." We both sat silently listening. Somewhere beyond the fallen house in which we were trapped came the sound of moving metal. It was a Martian. At first I thought that one of them had been injured and fell onto the house. Then the sun began to rise, and its light slowly came in through the boards that had fallen all around us. We could now see where we lay. The entire kitchen was in ruins. All around us lay broken plates and cups. Then, as I looked to my left, I saw that just outside of the kitchen there stood a Martian, quivering in his strange brown skin. It was just like I had seen that first day when the Martians first came out of their ship. It had not yet seen us, apparently. The curate and I carefully crawled into the shadows of the kitchen in order to hide. As we moved, it became clear in my mind what had happened last night. The fifth Martian cylinder had landed here, right upon the house in which we had been dining. We sat there in the shadows for a whole day, frightened out of our minds. Above us could be heard the sound of hammering as the Martians made their preparations to join the battle. The curate and I sat without moving, hour after hour. Finally, I could force my eyes open no more, and I fell into a deep sleep. Chapter 19. The Martians Up Close. When I awoke, the curate was lying on the other side of the kitchen with his head facing away from me. He was watching the Martians through a small hole in the wall. I quietly went over to him and touched him on the arm. This frightened him so much that he hit his head against the top of the hole and sent a large amount of dirt falling loudly to the ground outside the hole. Luckily, the Martians paid no attention. Looking out upon them, I could see that the Martians landed directly on top of the first house we had visited. It had completely disappeared now, and all of the land around the Martian ship had been violently thrown in all directions. The same was true of the house we were now inside. Except for the kitchen, the rest of the building had been blown away in the explosion. We were now buried under a huge mound of dirt, with the only means of escape being the Martian pit itself. Within the pit, there were several Martians working here and there. Just outside the entrance to their ship, a large metal machine with 5 arms was unloading equipment and placing it about the floor of the pit. Inside the machine, controlling its movements, sat one of the Martians. I was impressed by the speed with which the machine went about its work. It almost seemed like a living thing. Hidden as I was, it was easy for me to get a careful look at the Martians now. They seemed to be nothing more than huge walking heads. On one side of the head was a face with very large, dark eyes and a soft bird-like nose. On the other side was a strange, drum-like layer of skin that much later, when scientists could examine the Martians, proved to be an ear. On both sides of its mouth were 8 long arms, or hands, as the scientists later called them. Scientists reported that the most interesting thing about the Martians was that they did not eat. There was no system inside of them that was designed to take in food. Rather, they used a special device to suck the blood from other living beings. The blood was then placed into their own body, or I should say head, using the same device. I actually got an opportunity to see this happen. However, it was so upsetting to watch that I do not think I can go into detail about it here. So, the inside of the Martians was basically only a brain and lungs. Their bodies were simpler versions of the human structure. Again, I say body when I should say head. for that is all that they really were. Giant heads. And if you stop to think about it, it makes quite a lot of sense that their bodies should have disappeared over time. The human body is full of systems that slow us down, both physically and mentally. Take the way our bodies process food, for instance. It makes us quite tired and unable to think very clearly. The Martians do not have to deal with this, and when it comes to emotions, the Martians are equally in favor. Humans are only happy when their bodies are feeling healthy and alert. This, as we all know very well, can change from day to day. Martians, on the other hand, being made up almost totally entirely of brain matter, probably have no differences in their feelings, since their bodies undergo very few changes. There were a few other interesting facts that we later learned about these beings. First of all, their bodies never seemed to become tired. They, in fact, did not need sleep, but worked day and night. Secondly, they gave birth without having sex. Much like a plant, young Martians grew out of their parents' body. Without sex, it seems that they did not have the emotional problems from which humans always suffer. Thirdly, it seemed that the Martians did not suffer from the same kinds of diseases and illnesses that humans do. It is possible that Mars either never had the bacteria that causes such illnesses on Earth, or perhaps their scientists destroyed them all. One thing that I noticed, and it is fair to say that I saw the Martians at their work more than any other human did while they were here, was that they occasionally made a kind of cooing sound when they breathed out. At first, I thought that this must be their language, and indeed, it may be a part of it, but it most certainly is not their only means of communication. In fact, I strongly believe that their primary method of communicating is through their thoughts, otherwise known as mental telepathy. Chapter 20. Trapped in the Martian Pit. We were forced to hide ourselves when 2 fighting machines appeared in the pit. We hid in the back of the kitchen for hours, but our incredibly strong desire to continue watching the Martians caused us to risk our lives in order to get another look at them. The curate and I were not getting along at all at this point. We were completely different kinds of people. I hated his constant crying and hopeless talk. His talking and crying constantly prevented me from concentrating on a way to get out of our extremely difficult situation. He ate a lot of the food in the house, even after I pointed out that we might be trapped there for quite a while and might one day be without food if he continued to eat so much. Finally, his behavior became so foolish and careless that I had to start using physical force to control him. To this day, I still feel bad for my violent behavior, but those who have been in similar situations can understand the human tendency towards strong methods. One day, as I was watching the Martians work, I noticed a curious digging machine that would pick up large amounts of dirt and place it into a box that separated the dirt from the clay. The machine then took the clay and processed it somehow through a small machine on its backside. Just seconds later, what had once been clay now came out a brilliant metal tube. It was truly unbelievable how advanced their technological abilities were. Then came the first delivery of humans into the pit. The curate had been taking his turn to watch when suddenly he jumped back from the hole in the wall and ran to my side. I thought that he had been seen and that we were about to be killed. Nothing happened, though. After a few moments, I walked over to the hole in the wall to have a look at what had frightened the curate so much. At first, I saw nothing. It was dark now. The only light there was to see by was the green flame of the spider-like machines as they continued their restless work. Then I saw one of the fighting machines to my right raise a dark, moving object from the basket on its back. The green lights flashed, and revealed that the object in the machine's hand was a human. Then both the machine's hand and the human disappeared behind a hill of dirt. A horrible screaming then rose up into the night, along with the cooing sound of the Martians. I ran to the back of the kitchen and covered my ears to keep the sound of the screaming out. At that point, I decided that we had to somehow escape. The problem was that the curate was now totally crazy. He had no ability to think any longer. It was entirely up to me to find a way out. I thought of digging through the dirt to the opposite side of the house, but then I feared that I would easily be seen by one of the fighting machines when I emerged. Then I realized that our only hope was that the Martians might eventually leave their pit and move on. I started to feel that things were quite hopeless, not just for myself, but for all mankind. Then came the sound of bombs falling. Chapter 21. The Curate Dies. On the 6th day of being trapped inside the house, I remember looking out the hole into the pit and realizing that the curate was nowhere to be seen. I ran back into the kitchen storage area and found him drinking a bottle of wine. I took it from him and we began to fight. Finally, I pushed him back into the kitchen and refused to let him into the storage room. From that day on, I told him I would be controlling the food and drink, since he was no longer capable of controlling himself. For a day and a half, he and I fought with one another, sometimes with fists and sometimes with words. I tried to make him understand that we needed the food to last us a couple more weeks, but he had gone completely mad. He was practically an animal, so violent were his attacks on me at times. However, I succeeded in preventing him from entering the room. Finally, on the last day, he began to talk loudly. I tried shutting him up, but there was nothing I could do. He went on about how poorly he had served God, and then he would come back to the idea of food. He begged, and then, when I would not be persuaded, threatened. He said that he would run to the hole and get the Martians' attention if I did not give him more food. This frightened me, but I still stood firm at the entrance to the storage room. He then began to raise his voice, louder and louder. "Shut up, man!" I whispered. "Oh, God has forgotten his children. Speak to me, Lord. Ah, yes, the time has come for me to go. I know now what I must do. I am coming, you horrible beasts from hell. I am coming, you hear? God has made it his wish, and I must follow. Come, my blood is ready for your awful mouths." He shouted as loudly as he could, and began walking toward the hole in the wall. I knew that the Martians must have heard this, and I became so angry that I grabbed the largest knife in the kitchen and ran after him. I was ready to kill, but at that very last moment I turned the knife's blade away from him and struck him on the back of the head to knock him out. Then I heard the sound of approaching metal, and the kitchen suddenly grew darker. In a moment, I could see the digging machine right outside the hole. One of its long arms suddenly came into the kitchen, feeling along the floor and walls. Then, on the other side of the hole, I could see inside the machine, behind a sheet of glass, the eyes of a Martian. I ran back into the storage area, wondering whether it had seen me or not. I opened the door to the coal storage area and hid in there, listening silently to the sounds of the machine's metal arms searching the kitchen. Then came the sound of a body being pulled across the floor. I knew that the Martian had found the curate's body. I could not control myself any longer. My curiosity was much too great. Quietly, I opened the door to the storage area and crawled out to see what I could. Looking around the doorway, I saw the curate's body laying face down, his head already through the hole in the wall. The Martian was examining his head very carefully. Then, very suddenly, the idea came to me that the curate's head injury might reveal my presence to the Martian. Immediately, I crawled back into the coal storage room, shut the door, and began to bury myself under the coal and firewood inside. The sound of the metallic arm slithering across the stone floor came closer and closer. It was now in the main storage area, feeling the door to the coal room. A terrible feeling of fear ran through my whole body. Then the door slowly opened and the arm came sliding in like a snake, examining the coal, as well as the walls. I could not believe that the Martians knew how to handle our doors. At one point, the arm actually touched my shoe. I wanted to scream, but forced my mouth to stay closed. Then the arm stopped moving and the room was silent for quite a while. So much time passed that I was no longer sure if it was still in the room with me. Then I heard it take hold of something. I thought that it had grabbed me, but I could not be sure. It soon became clear that it had taken hold of a piece of coal to examine. Soon the door closed and I could hear the sound of breaking bottles as the arm moved back into the kitchen. I stayed in that little room, covered in coal and wood, for a whole day and night. I did not know whether the arm was waiting for me to reveal myself or whether it had gone back to working. So I remained there, terribly thirsty and hungry until the 11th day. Chapter 22. My Escape from the Pit. When I finally came out, I found that the Martian had emptied the storage area of all its food and drink. So I was forced to go without anything for 2 more days. I sat in the storage area quite upset about my current situation. For a moment, I thought I had lost my ability to hear, for the sounds of the pit that I had gotten so used to could no longer be heard. I eventually gained enough courage to use the rainwater tap, which was quite noisy, to get a drink. I feared that the Martians would hear me turn the nozzle, but nothing happened. Day number 12 and 13 I spent going back and forth between dreams about the horrible death of the curate and wonderfully large dinners. I felt guilt and then I felt nothing. On the 15th day, I heard the sound of a dog moving just outside of the hole in the kitchen wall, which had recently been covered by a strange, thick red plant that had quickly spread throughout most of the pit. My first idea was to quietly get the dog to come inside so that I could kill it for food, but it ran away as soon as it knew of my presence. Outside, there was no sound except for the occasional song of a bird. I looked very carefully through the leaves of the red plant and found that the entire pit was now empty of machines. The only thing left behind were the bodies of the humans they had drained of blood. It had finally come, my opportunity to escape. I quickly worked my way out of the hole and began to climb up the side of the deep pit. When I got to the top, I looked around for any signs of Martians in the area. There were none. The once beautiful neighborhood of houses was now reduced to nothing. None of the houses had been burned. They were all simply blown over. The red vegetation covered the ground as far as I could see. It even grew in some of the few houses that still stood, their windows completely blown out. I wondered if the Martians had planted it or if it had accidentally come along. In any case, it was spreading very rapidly. Above me, the sky was beautifully clear and blue, and the air smelled wonderfully fresh. Chapter 23. A Surprise Reunion. Looking around, I was struck by a new feeling. It was the same feeling that any animal might have upon returning to its home and finding that everything had been destroyed by humans in order to build a house of their own. It was the feeling that humans were no longer the rulers of the earth. Now we were simple animals, just like birds or bears. All of our safety and security was now gone. we would be hunted as food for the rest of our days. I stopped thinking about these things when I realized how hungry I was. I looked about the area and saw a garden in the distance. Slowly I walked through the many tall red plants until I reached the garden. I hoped I would find something to eat there. Fortunately, there were some carrots and other vegetables in the ground. Quickly, I gathered as many as I could and walked to the nearest road, eating the whole time. When I reached the Thames River, I found that the red plant had filled it and sent its water overflowing into the fields and yards that ran next to it. Some towns were completely covered in water and the red plant life. But as I walked on, it became clear that the Martian plant life was dying very quickly. It seemed that the plant could not survive under the ordinary conditions of Earth. The branches were turning white and becoming very dry and weak. I grabbed a few branches and they crumbled into dust at my feet. I walked along the river and did not see much change until I reached the town of Putney Common. There, I recognized the work of the Martian's heat ray. Many of the houses were burned completely to the ground, and yet, right next door to them were perfectly untouched homes, looking as though their owners were simply away on vacation. In fact, there were no humans to be found among the streets or houses. I managed to enter a few of the homes, but was unsuccessful in finding food. Most of them had already been emptied. I continued to move on, and along the way found a few animal bones here and there. I chewed on them in order to try and get at least some of the remaining meat, but found that it had already been eaten away. I also found many human bodies with nothing but the bones left lying on the ground. I began to think that I might be one of the few people left in this part of the world. That night I slept in a real bed. It was the first bed I had slept in since the night before I left my wife in Leatherhead. After finding what I could to eat, I lay in bed thinking. I mainly thought about three things: the curate, the Martians, and my wife. The first I did not feel too guilty about. I felt that the curate's death was unavoidable. I looked back upon all of our conversations and all of our time spent together, and although I am uncomfortable with the part I played in his death, I can see no other way for things to have turned out. It is hard to imagine that you yourself could be driven to act in the same horrible ways you have read about others having behaved in history books. But I am witness to it. I, a simple philosopher who wanted only to better his world, had played a part in 2 deaths since the beginning of these terrible times. First, there was the pub owner, whose horse and wagon I took, and now there was the curate. Of the 2, I felt guilt only for the first, for the second would have walked out to his death anyway, if I had not struck him. I was mostly uncomfortable with the violence that had shown itself within me. The physical abuse I delivered to the half-crazed curate is nothing I am at all proud of. I have written it down in order not to hide anything about this unique period in human history, and I suppose that now it is up to the reader to decide whether my actions were right or wrong. My thoughts on both the Martians and my wife were mixed together, for I feared that something horrible might have happened to her. Then I did something I had not done for quite some time. I prayed. I prayed that she might be safe and healthy at that moment, and if she were no longer alive, that her death had been a quick and painless one. As I prayed, I wondered if the Martians also prayed as well. I wanted to go to Leatherhead to find my wife, but I knew that if she were still alive, she and my cousins would have run away with the rest of the people. However, it was also possible that someone there might know where she had gone. And suddenly, all this thinking about her made me begin to feel lonely and sad. I decided to move on through Wimbledon in order to keep my spirits up. I thought that as long as I kept moving, hope still existed. After several hours of walking in darkness, the sun rose and shone down on the land. Everything shined with a beautiful golden glow. The warm sun made me feel better, and I began to walk faster. Suddenly, a noise in some nearby bushes frightened me. I stopped to see what might be hiding in the shadows. A dark figure rose up from behind. It was a man. His clothing was as dirty as mine, and he was holding a long knife. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. "This is my town now. You can't stay here," he shouted. "That's all right. I did not plan to stay in your town. I'm going to Leatherhead to try and find my wife," I said. He looked at me curiously for a moment without saying a word. "Wait a minute. I know you," he said. "You're the guy from Woking. We separated at Weybridge." I then realized that this was the artilleryman. "I can't believe it's you," he went on. "That must have been more than 2 weeks ago. And look, your hair's turned grey in some places. You must have had a terrible experience." "We've all had a bad time," I said. "Are there any Martians in the area?" "No. I think most of them are up in London. At night you can see the lights of their camp. It's like an incredible modern city. I did see a couple of them about 5 or 6 days ago. They were carrying something rather large between the two of them, and several days ago I saw something from their camp fly up into the sky." "Are you serious? Well, then the whole world's in trouble now." "In trouble?" the artilleryman laughed. "The human race is going to die, my friend. We have lost this war. We were only able to kill one Martian. There's nothing to be done." I tried to think of a way to argue, but I could not come up with anything to say. "We are nothing more than insects now," he continued. "Stupid little insects that fight amongst one another until the real beings come along and decide it's time to end our stupid little meaningless lives." I then pointed out that they had only fired the gun on Mars 10 times. If there were no more Martians than these, then maybe we could come together and defeat them somehow. "Maybe their gun simply broke momentarily. In time they could surely repair it and start shooting their Martian soldiers to Earth again. But I don't think that is what has happened. No, I think that they sent a few of their soldiers to destroy the most powerful nation on Earth and take away our ability to defend ourselves. Once they finish that, they will then send more Martians and begin to capture humans regularly and keep us in cages for food." "If this is true, then what's the point of living any longer?" I cried. "I don't know about you, but I'm going to keep on living because I don't want to die. I don't care so much about the loss of our culture and civilization, sad as it may be. I'm not going to let that make my life seem pointless. I've gone to many a concert and social engagement. I later realized that I could have lived without. Most of all, I'm absolutely not going to let those ugly monsters get a hold of me." I was impressed by his strong desire to live. Suddenly, I began to feel the same desire, and I took his hand and shook it. "Okay, I'm with you," I said. "Tell me what you've got in mind." "Well, first, let me tell you about what I see happening to man in the near future. All those men who ran to their offices every day, men who lived to work meaningless jobs and live meaningless lives when the Martians were not here, they will become Martian food. In fact, I think they might even one day become Martian pets, and they will accept this kind of life. They will do nothing to fight it. We, on the other hand, who refuse this kind of slavery, will have to move underground to live. London is full of underground pipes and tunnels. Sure, they were dirty when London was full of people, but now it will be quite empty, which means a cleaner underground. We'll then start our own group of strong-minded, simple men who know how to survive. All others will not be allowed to live with us. They must go and be Martian food, because that's all they'll be good for. And that include the women as well. We need a pure race. Anyone who is weak-minded must die. We'll gather as many of the great scientific books in the museums as we can, so that we can continue our progress. We'll send people to spy on the Martians and keep up with their progress as well. And instead of fighting the Martians, we'll just stay out of their way. If they don't feel threatened or annoyed by us, I think they'll be more likely to leave us alone. But all the while, we'll be studying their ways and improving our own until one day a man climbs into one of those Martian fighting machines and starts using it against the Martians. I hope I live long enough to see that day, let me tell you. We talked for several hours about his plans. Although I could see some problems with his ideas, I liked them nonetheless, and started to feel his excitement. We then went back to his hiding place in the basement of a house on Putney Hill. He showed me the hole that he had been digging for the past week or so. I must admit that I was a bit disappointed. I felt that I could have done as much work in one day. Regardless, I helped him to dig further, for he believed that underneath were the tunnels he had earlier spoken about. I helped him dig for about an hour, thinking more and more about the problems with his plans. Then he stopped and suggested that we go out and have a look around for Martians. I did not understand why this was necessary and suggested that we keep digging. But then I thought about how I had run into him out among the fields. "Why weren't you here digging earlier?" I asked. "Oh, I just thought I'd have a nice walk," he said. "But aren't you in a hurry to get through to the underground? Why stop working?" He only answered by suggesting that we go have another look about town for Martians. I then understood that this man was not quite as strong-willed as he had led me to believe. We went outside and walked about the village. We saw nothing but patches of that red Martian plant life here and there, covering sections of the fields and climbing up the sides of trees, mingling with the leaves. While walking about, he told me a story about some survivors who had not left London like the rest of the people. This small group of people had somehow managed to get the electricity back on in a certain part of the city. Seeing their success, they all went out into the street and partied well into the evening, drinking and singing and dancing. Suddenly, one of the Martian fighting machines appeared and picked up about 200 of those people and disappeared down the street. We then returned to the house, and my companion became more cheerful. He was happy to have me around, it seemed. Together we made a rather big meal, and afterwards smoked cigars of the highest quality. Then we spent much of the rest of the day drinking champagne and playing card games. Eventually the artilleryman fell asleep from all of his drinking. I had only 2 glasses, for I did not like champagne very much, nor was I especially in the mood for celebration. I decided to go outside again and have a look at those lights he had mentioned to me earlier in the day. As I looked off into the distant red glow of the still burning area of Kensington, I began to feel ashamed of myself. Here I was eating large meals, smoking cigars, and drinking champagne, while the rest of humanity was suffering just a few miles away. I immediately decided to leave this man to his useless dreams and go on to London to see what the people who really wanted to save the human race were doing. Chapter 24. Walking Through the Remains of London. As I moved further and further into London, I found the streets covered in black dust. The only people I saw were those lying dead in the street, their bodies horribly burned. I did come across one living man, but he was so drunk that he could not stand. His clothing was completely covered in dust, and when I tried to talk with him, he did nothing but shout at me and try to hit me with his bottle. I walked on, thinking how strange the silence was. It was not a peaceful silence, but a dangerous one in which one expects something horrible to happen. When I reached South Kensington, the silence was suddenly broken by the sound of a fighting machine that was coming. I stayed in the shadows along Exhibition Street and made my way toward Hyde Park. Along the way, I came upon a bus that had been pushed over onto its side. Nearby, there were the remains of a horse that had been completely eaten down to the bone by some kind of animal. Again, the cry of the fighting machine filled the air. Oola, oola, oola. I could not see it, but it seemed to be coming closer, or I was coming closer to it. I turned off again, now headed for Oxford Street. As I walked, the faces of old friends came into my mind, and once again I realized how lonely I was. I missed my old way of life terribly. Eventually, I broke into a restaurant where I found some food and drink. Afterward, I felt sleepy, and so I went to a back room and lay down on the sofa to have a rest. When I later awoke, the sun was setting, and I could still hear the crying of the Martian machine. Not feeling particularly safe in the pub, I walked back out into the streets and continued my tour of the now dead city of London. After only a few minutes, I found myself near Baker Street. Just over the tops of some trees, there appeared the head of the Martian machine that had been crying out all this time. Strangely enough, I did not feel afraid. I walked out into the open, staring curiously at the giant machine, and it did nothing but remain motionless. I decided that I should get a better look at the machine, so I turned down some back streets and made my way toward it from the east. When it came into sight again, I could see that it had been seriously damaged. It looked as though it had run into a building and fallen underneath the ruins. With the last of the day's sunlight, I could just barely see what I thought might be blood in the driver's seat. I moved on and found another Martian fighting machine at Primrose Hill. It too cried out, "Oola, oola, oola," and did not move. As I passed by, I noticed on the other side of the Martian that the red plant life had spread through London's river canals. Then the crying of the machine suddenly stopped, and a shocking silence fell over the city. The stillness made me frightened again. I felt that I was surrounded by enemies waiting in the darkness for the right moment to attack. Everything looked evil. Even the houses with their ghost-like windows seemed to be watching me. I began to run toward Kilburn and spotted a horrible-looking body lying far down the road before me. I turned and went in another direction for fear of what I might find. For the rest of the night, I closed myself inside a cabman's shelter and waited for my courage to return. Then, just before sunrise, I decided to go back out into the streets to have a look. I found my way back to Primrose Hill, and the first thing that I saw was yet another Martian fighting machine. Just like the others, it now stood silent, as though sleeping. Upon walking closer, I saw dozens of birds flying in circles about its domed head. My heart suddenly leaped with excitement, and I began to run toward the giant. An idea had formed in my mind, but I did not want to use it before I actually knew the truth. I finally made it to the top of the hill that overlooked the last pit the Martians had made. It was huge and filled with all kinds of war machines and bodies. This time, however, the bodies were not human. No, there before me lay the bodies of at least 50 Martians. I wanted to shout with joy at the sight. The Martians, despite their incredible intelligence and their highly advanced technology, had lost the battle in the end. The battle had not, however, been won by the humans, whose weapons proved useless in the fight. It had been won by the Earth, by nature. The Martians, who were not exposed to any bacteria on Mars, were practically swimming in it here on our planet. Although bacteria often bring sickness and death to men, this time it had saved us all from the Martians. Looking down into the pit, I could now see the flying machine that the Martians had been building just before they fell to their deaths. Dozens of dogs were running about the pit, eating the Martian bodies. It was strange indeed to look at the once horrifying fighting machines and now feel no fear whatsoever. I wanted to laugh at their harmlessness. From where I stood, I could see most of London spread out before me. How amazing it was that it still stood here after so much death and destruction. And even though terribly damaged, how lovely and alive it looked to me now. Soon, people would be returning to London and their homes. They would begin their lives again. I could already hear the sound of hammers at work in my mind, and what beautiful music it made. And then the thought of my own home and my family came back to me. Hope came upon me stronger than ever before. Maybe I could have my old life back again. Chapter 25. My Return Home. I am not sure why, but I cannot remember what happened over the next 3 days. I must have been completely overcome with relief and joy. Over time, I learned that I was not quite the first person to realize the end of the Martians had come. It turns out that while I was hiding in the cabman's shelter, another gentleman had come across the dead Martians and immediately set out to inform the world by telegraph. I had no idea that at the very same moment I was looking down upon the ruins of the Martian pit, most of the world was celebrating the liberation of England. Of course, the last people to know were the English themselves, for most of them were still in hiding. However, once the news reached them, they came running back to their beloved London. Countries from all over the world began to send food to the English, and it seemed that every ship in the ocean was headed toward our fair country. As for me, an extremely kind family found me wandering the streets, half mad, singing songs about being the last man alive in the world. They took me into their home and took care of me, patiently waiting and hoping I would soon regain my senses. I, of course, did calm down after about 4 days. They gave me another day's rest before breaking the news to me that all of Leatherhead had been destroyed. Not a single person survived the attack. I stayed with them for 4 more days, feeling hopelessly sad and lonely. They did their best to help me, which I find amazing, considering that they had their own problems to deal with. The desire to revisit my hometown was so strong in me that I told the family that I would have to leave right away. They tried to change my mind, but I could not be reasoned with. I set out on the 9th day and found the streets of London once again alive with thousands of people. I was very surprised to see that some stores had already reopened and that water was flowing from some of the fountains in the squares. The sun that day was so bright that I felt it was making a joke of my sad situation. Most of the people I saw on the street seemed to be either unbelievably happy or quietly accepting of their circumstances. Most of the people looked tired and unhealthy. Their clothing was still dirty, and their hair a filthy mess. While crossing Waterloo Bridge, I caught sight of a man selling newspapers. It was the first newspaper to go back into print. The news indicated that much had already been learned from the scientists' examination of the Martian equipment. The scientists even thought that they had discovered the secret of flying. Much to my relief, I had an entire compartment on the train all to myself. It seemed that over the 9 days of my recovery, most of the people had managed to return to their homes. I had no desire to converse with anyone, and spent the entire train ride silently staring out the window at the changed countryside. Most of the towns I passed were in smoking ruins. Only one town seemed untouched, but that was only because its thick forest of pine trees hid the destruction from the train passengers. When I arrived at Byfleet Station, I exited the train and walked toward my town of Maybury. I came upon the overturned wagon I had rented from the pub owner, and next to it were the bones of his horse. I stood there in quiet thought for quite some time before moving on. A man standing outside of the neighborhood pub greeted me by name as I approached. I returned the greeting and asked about the pub owner. He told me that he had been buried a few days before. I thanked him for the information and started the last few meters to my home. At first, I thought that there was hope for my wife to be there, but that thought quickly disappeared when I saw that the house was in the same condition I had left it in that night of the storm. The lock on the front door was broken, and when I entered the front hallway, I saw stains on the floor from when I had returned to the house, soaking wet and hidden from the Martians. The tracks of both mine and the artilleryman's footsteps still led up the stairs and into my study, and there on the table lay the paper on which I had started my latest philosophical article. I went back downstairs and saw the remains of the meal the artilleryman and I had had before running out of town. The house was so silent and lonely. I felt a terrible sadness building up inside of me. Then I heard a voice from behind me say, "Let's go. It was unwise to come here. It's obvious that no one has survived." For a moment, I thought that I might have said the words to myself, but then I ran to the window and found myself looking into the eyes of my cousin and my wife. We stayed that way, silent and staring in disbelief for several moments before I saw my wife's eyes start to turn upward, and I ran to catch her before she completely fainted. Epilogue. As I look back on the pages I have here written, it has become clear to me that not everyone will completely agree with my story. There are many questions about why and how the Martians died so quickly. I, however, am not an expert in the area of biological science, so I am happy with the popular reports. It has not yet been made clear what exactly the Martians' black gas consisted of. Scientists found an unknown substance among the contents, but they have yet to understand it completely, nor are its effects on the human body very clear. Of course, because so few people actually saw the Martians themselves, people have taken great interest in the Martian body that has been preserved and put on display at the Museum of Natural History in London. Very few of these were remaining due to the number of wild dogs that had seized upon them just after death. This one is almost in perfect condition. Surprisingly, one subject which is not very often discussed is the possibility of another Martian attack. Personally, I am quite concerned, for it seems very likely to happen someday. I feel that we should be keeping a close eye on Mars, especially the area where the gun was seen shooting the cylinders to our planet. Earth should always be ready for a second attack. In fact, I think that the Martians' failure has given humans a hint as to how to defend themselves should history repeat itself. For example, we now know that the Martians are powerless when they first land, for they have to wait for their cylinder to cool or they will burn themselves. We could simply destroy the cylinder during this early period. If no bombs are available at the time, guns could be set upon the Martians as they first come out of their cylinder. In other words, I do not think that the Martians will have as easy a time if they attacked us in the same manner. But then again, they may be aware of this themselves and could already have started planning a new method of attack. In any case, the attack on Earth has benefited man in some ways. First of all, it has made us more aware of the idea that perhaps we are not the highest form of life in the universe. This is a good thing because man had become quite arrogant and abused his powers over less powerful creatures like animals and plants. Maybe now man will be kinder to the animals on this planet. The second benefit is the technology that has been passed on to us. I believe that over the next 100 years, man may make incredible scientific leaps forward. Who knows? Maybe one day we will be visiting other planets ourselves. I have to say that I am not as comfortable with my life on Earth as I was before the war. Every day I look out the window of my study, and I see the slowly recovering landscape once again on fire. I see the milkman pass my home and the children running to school, and I remember all of those frightened faces as people ran from Woking that terrible Saturday. I visit London and I see all of the business in the streets, the fruit sellers and the pub owners, and I remember all of those horribly burned bodies that filled the streets. I pass the still motionless metal fighting machine that today stands in the center of town as a reminder of the war, and a terrible cold feeling runs through my body as I recall that stormy night when that first giant fighting machine walked over me as I lay helpless in the mud. I am always thinking about these events, but the thing that affects me the most and always brings me to tears is when I look at my wife and think that she and I once thought the other was dead. I hope that the people of the future will never experience such terrible things. However, I am afraid that future people of the earth will experience more war and death. Not because of more Martian attacks, but because men will continue to fight with each other. It is my hope that of all the things that we learned from the Martians, is we learned the need for peace on earth, for that is the best way for the human race to survive.